There was a boy in Germany who looked at the horizon and saw not a barrier, but a promise that refused to be broken. In the long, uncertain years after the Great War, when the country felt smaller than it once had and the future seemed written by hands that did not belong to the German people, young Erich Topp discovered something inside himself that the treaties and the troubles could not touch. He was a quiet child, the kind who watched more than he spoke, who carried his thoughts carefully like small, valuable objects he did not want to drop. The world around him was still raw from defeat. Families spoke in lowered voices about ships that had been surrendered, about pride that had been taken away at the stroke of a pen. The sea, which had once carried German sailors to distant oceans with confidence, now felt like a distant memory that only the old men dared to mention openly. Yet for this boy, the sea was not memory. It was alive. It called to him in the rustle of wind through trees that reminded him of canvas, in the way light played on any stretch of water he could reach, and the stories that slipped out during evening meals when the radio was turned low. His family, like so many others, carried the quiet weight of those years. There were evenings when the table felt too large for the food upon it, when small sacrifices were made without complaint because complaining changed nothing. Erich noticed these things the way only a thoughtful child can, not with resentment, but with a growing understanding that strength sometimes looked like endurance rather than victory. He began to find his own form of strength in the idea of the sea. It represented something larger than the street where he lived, larger than the headlines that came and went. The sea did not care about treaties or inflation or the arguments in the streets. It simply waited, vast and patient, for those willing to answer it. He started with small things. A piece of wood found behind the house became a hull. Bits of string and paper became rigging. He would sit for hours on the floor of his room, shaping these modest vessels with a concentration that made the rest of the world fade. When he finished one, he would hold it up to the light from the window and imagine the real deck beneath his feet, the steady roll of waves, the responsibility of command. These were not just toys. They were rehearsals for a life he had already decided was his. His mother watched him sometimes from the doorway, a mixture of pride and worry in her eyes. She understood that boys needed dreams, especially in a time when so many dreams had been taken from their fathers. She never told him to stop. Instead, she would sometimes bring him an old photograph or a newspaper clipping about ships from before the war, small gifts that said more than words. His father, when he spoke of the old Navy at all, did so with a careful pride that never crossed into bitterness. Those conversations stayed with Erich. They taught him that true service was not about shouting or glory. It was about competence, about keeping your head when others lost theirs, about the quiet knowledge that your ship and your men depended on you. There were days when the larger world pressed in. The economic storms that swept through Germany in the early years after the war turned ordinary life into a daily negotiation. Erich saw neighbors trade furniture for bread, saw the look that passed between his parents when prices changed overnight. In those moments the sea became more than a dream. It became a refuge. He would walk to whatever water he could reach, a river, a canal, even a puddle after rain, and stand there until the chaos inside him settled. The horizon, even when it was only the far bank of a modest waterway, gave him something steady to fix his eyes upon. He learned early that a man could carry calm inside him even when everything outside was uncertain. That lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life. School brought its own lessons. Teachers spoke of history and duty, sometimes with the careful language required by the times. Erich listened, but he also watched. He noticed which boys shouted the loudest about restoring the nation and which ones simply went about their work with quiet determination. He already knew which kind of man he wanted to become. The sea did not reward noise. It rewarded those who could read the weather, who could hold a course when the instruments failed, who could make the right decision when every second mattered. He began to practice those qualities in small ways, finishing tasks others abandoned, staying calm when games turned rough, offering help without being asked. These were not performances. They were the first expressions of a character that was already forming around the idea of service. One afternoon that stayed with him for years, he stood on a low hill overlooking a stretch of water that eventually found its way to the open sea. The wind was cold and carried the faint scent of salt. For a long time he simply watched the surface move, the way light and shadow played across it, the distant shape of a small vessel making its way toward whatever destination waited beyond the curve of the earth. In that moment the boy felt something settle inside him that had nothing to do with politics or anger or even excitement. It was certainty. The sea was not asking him to be a hero. It was asking him to be ready. Ready to learn, ready to endure, ready to take responsibility for others when the time came. He did not speak the thought aloud. He simply carried it home with him, added it to the collection of quiet resolves that were already shaping the man he would become. As the years passed and the world continued to change around him, that resolve deepened rather than faded. The political voices grew louder, promising to restore what had been lost. Erich heard them, but he measured them against the steadier voice of the sea he carried inside. He understood that real restoration would not come from speeches or marches. It would come from men who had prepared themselves in the quiet years, who had learned their craft, who had kept their character intact when it would have been easier to let it bend. The boy who had once carved ships from scrap wood was already practicing the discipline that would one day make him a commander others could trust with their lives. What Erich could not yet see, standing on that hill or sitting at his table with his models, was how completely that early longing would define everything that followed. The same calm that let a child find peace in the middle of national uncertainty would later let a captain hold his nerve when depth charges hunted his boat. The same patient attention to detail that shaped those small wooden hulls would later shape the way he trained his crews and planned his attacks. The sea had claimed him long before he ever set foot on a warship. It had claimed him in the ordinary moments of a childhood spent in a Germany still learning how to stand again. That same spirit of answering the call, of finding purpose and service at sea even when the path is uncertain and the world feels broken, runs through every chapter of naval history. If the story of this thoughtful boy who looked to the horizon and refused to let his dream be taken from him has stirred something in you, then you will find a powerful companion in another great chapter of courage on the waves. The acclaimed film Midway brings to life the extraordinary bravery and sacrifice of sailors and aviators who faced their own impossible trials in the Pacific, men who, like the young Erich Topp, answered the sea's demanding call when their nations needed them most. It is a stirring tribute that honors the shared legacy of duty and sacrifice across all who served on the oceans during those dark years. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The boy who once stood by the water, heart full of quiet resolve, was already walking the first steps of a journey that would carry him across oceans and through the most terrible war the world had ever known. The horizon had called. He had answered. And the sea, patient as ever, was waiting. He stood at the gangway with his seed bag over his shoulder, the great gray hull of the cruiser rising above him like a floating city of discipline and destiny, and for a moment the young man who had once carved ships from wood felt both smaller and more alive than he had ever been. The salt air carried the sharp scent of steel and fuel, the low thrum of the ship's generators vibrating through the deck plates beneath his boots. Around him, other young men in new uniforms moved with the careful awkwardness of those still learning how to inhabit their bodies in this new world. Some laughed too loudly to hide their nerves. Others kept their eyes fixed on the deck, as if looking up might betray how much they were feeling. Erich Topp stepped forward when his name was called, saluted the officer of the watch with a precision that came from hours of practice in front of a mirror at home, and crossed onto the ship that would become both his school and his first true home at sea. Life aboard the cruiser settled into a rhythm that was at once exhausting and strangely comforting. The day began before first light with the sound of boots on steel ladders and the sharp calls of petty officers whose voices seemed to carry the accumulated experience of generations of sailors. Erich learned quickly that the Navy did not ask for enthusiasm. It asked for correctness, for repetition until the correct way became the only way his hands and feet knew. He scrubbed decks until his palms blistered, then learned to do it again without complaint. He stood watching the cold hours before dawn, the wind cutting through his jacket while the ship rolled gently in the harbor swell, and discovered that the loneliness of those watches could be eased by the simple presence of another man sharing the same cold and the same duty. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed close. In the first weeks, letters from home arrived folded small and tucked into the pockets of his working uniform. He would find a quiet corner of the mess deck, the smell of coffee and wet wool heavy in the air, and read them slowly, letting the familiar handwriting pull him back to the world he had left. His mother's careful words about the weather and the garden carried an undertone of worry she never wrote outright. His father's shorter notes spoke of pride without saying the word. Erich would fold each letter carefully and keep it in the small metal box beneath his hammock, a private archive of the life that continued without him. Sometimes, when the ship was at sea and the motion made sleep difficult, he would reach for one of those letters in the dark, not to read it again but simply to feel the paper that had come from home. The friendships that formed in those early months were unlike any he had known on land. They were forged in shared discomfort and small mercies. There was a fellow cadet named Carl who had a habit of humming old marching songs under his breath during long clinging details, a sound that somehow made the work less endless. Another, quieter young man named Hans, struggled with the constant motion of the ship and turned pale during rough weather. Erich found himself staying up with Hans during those nights, not offering advice but simply sharing the watch so the other man would not face the nausea and fear alone. In return, Hans showed him how to read the subtle signs in the sky that told of coming weather, a skill passed down from his own father who had sailed before the war. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet exchanges that turned strangers into brothers who would one day trust each other with their lives. The training itself was relentless but purposeful. The old Navy still operated with the precision of a machine that had been refined over decades, even if the political world outside the ship was shifting. Erich felt the difference in the way senior officers spoke to the cadets, not as boys to be broken, but as future officers who must be shaped. A grizzled chief petty officer took him aside one afternoon after a particularly poor showing during a damage control drill. The man did not shout. He simply demonstrated, again and again, the correct way to secure a hatch under simulated flooding until Erich's hands moved without thinking. When the drill was finally done right, the chief gave a single nod and walked away. That nod stayed with Erich longer than any praise could have. It was the first time he understood that in this world, competence itself was a form of kindness. Overseas training voyages took the ship far from familiar waters. In foreign ports, the young cadets saw cities and people who lived lives untouched by the arguments that filled German newspapers. They walked streets where the war had never reached in the same way, and the contrast made the world feel both larger and more fragile. Erich stood on deck one evening in a warm southern harbor, the lights of the city reflecting on the water, and listened to older sailors speak quietly of the old high seas fleet and what had been lost. They did not speak with anger. They spoke with the steady tone of men who had accepted that their duty now was to pass on what remained, the skills, the discipline, the silent understanding that a ship at sea demanded everything from those who served her. Erich absorbed these conversations without adding his own voice. He was still learning how to carry the weight of tradition without letting it become a burden. The political changes back home reached them in fragments, newspapers that arrived weeks late, radio broadcasts that crackled with new voices promising restoration and strength. Some of the cadets embraced the energy of those promises. Others kept their focus on the daily work of the ship, sensing that the sea would test them regardless of which flag flew over the harbor. Erich found himself in the second group. He listened to the debates in the mess, sometimes joining when asked, but more often watching how different men reacted to the same news. He noticed that the best officers, the ones whose respect he wanted most, rarely spoke of politics at all. They spoke of the ship, of the men, of the next evolution or the coming weather. That professional silence became its own kind of oath for him, the decision to serve the tradition of the sea rather than the noise of the moment. There were nights when the ship rolled heavily and sleep would not come. Erich would climb to a sheltered spot on the upper deck, the wind carrying spray that stung his face, and stand there until the motion of the hull beneath him became almost soothing. In those hours he felt the full distance between the boy who had carved model ships and the man he was becoming. The sea no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a teacher that would never stop asking questions. He thought of the friends he had made, of the letters tucked away, of the quiet chief who had shown him how to do the work correctly. He thought of home and of the horizon that still waited somewhere beyond the next port. The fear that sometimes rose in his chest was not the fear of failure. It was the fear of not being ready when the real test came, the test that no training cruise could fully prepare any man to face. Yet with each month that passed, the ship and its routines worked their slow transformation. Erich learned to read the mood of the sea and the color of the water and the set of the waves. He learned to give orders in a voice that carried without shouting. He learned that leadership was less about being the strongest voice and more about being the one others could count on when everything else was uncertain. Small moments of recognition came from unexpected places, a nod from a senior midshipman after a successful mooring evolution, a shared cigarette, and a few quiet words with Carl after a long night watch. The way Hans now stood straighter even in rough weather because someone had once stood with him. These were the real lessons, the ones that no manual could teach. By the time the training period neared its end, Erich understood something fundamental about the path he had chosen. The Navy he was joining was still the old Navy in its bones, the one built on salt, steel, and oaths that did not need to be spoken aloud because they were lived every day in the way men treated each other and the way they treated their ship. The world outside was changing rapidly, and those changes would eventually reach even the most isolated deck at sea. But the character being forged here, in the long watches and the shared discomfort and the quiet kindnesses between men who had little else to give, would remain. That character would be tested in ways none of them could yet imagine. The bonds formed in these steel corridors and on these rolling decks would one day be the only thing some of them had left to hold on to. Those same bonds, and the professional discipline that made them possible, would carry these young officers into a war at sea whose true face remained hidden from the public eye for decades afterward. The training on ships like this one built skill and character, but it could never fully prepare any man for the raw exhaustion, the sudden losses, the moments of desperate courage, and the quiet endurance that defined the years of fighting across the Atlantic. Those realities lived in the memories of the men who survived them and in the images and accounts that were never meant for ordinary broadcast. An exclusive digital collection now available brings together rare and censored photographs, original wartime footage, and veteran testimonies from that hidden struggle, material that reveals the unfiltered human cost and the unvarnished truth of what those who trained on these decks eventually faced. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The young man who had stepped aboard with a sea bag and a quiet resolve was no longer the same person who would one day walk away from the cruiser. He carried now the salt in his clothes, the steel in his posture, and the silent oaths in his heart, the ones that would guide him through everything that was still to come. The decision came in the quiet space between watches, when the surface of the sea no longer felt like enough and the deeper challenge had become the only path that made sense. He had returned from the training cruises on the cruiser with salt still in his clothes and a steadier sense of who he was becoming. The discipline of the big ship had shaped him, the friendships forged in shared watches had given him anchors, and the long nights at sea had taught him that the horizon always asked more than it gave. Yet something inside him remained unsatisfied. The call that had begun in childhood with carved wooden hulls and whispered stories of distant voyages had grown stronger, not quieter. It now pointed downward, into the steel tubes that slipped beneath the waves and vanished from sight. Volunteering for the U-boat service was not a decision made in a burst of bravado. It was the slow, deliberate acknowledgement that the greatest test of seamanship and nerve waited in the silent world below the surface. He spoke with his commanding officer on a gray morning when the harbor water slapped gently against the hull. The older man listened without interruption, then asked the questions that mattered most. Not about glory or adventure, but about whether he understood the odds, whether he could live with the knowledge that many who chose this path would not return, whether he was prepared to lead men into a darkness where rescue was often impossible. Erich answered honestly. He had no illusions. He had seen the lists of boats that failed to return even during training accidents, had heard the careful silences when older sailors spoke of friends who had simply disappeared beneath the waves. The fear was real. It lived in the pit of his stomach on nights when sleep would not come. But alongside the fear was something steadier, the conviction that the sea had always been his true element, and that the most demanding version of service was the one he could not turn away from. The process of volunteering itself carried its own weight. There were medical examinations that probed not only the body but the mind, questions designed to reveal whether a man could endure the psychological pressure of confined spaces and constant risk. There were interviews with officers who had already served in the boats, men whose eyes carried the look of those who had seen too much and said too little. Erich sat through these meetings with the same calm he had learned on the cruiser's rolling decks. He did not boast. He simply stated that he was ready to learn what the service would teach him and to accept whatever came with it. When the approval finally came, it arrived without ceremony, a brief nod and a set of orders that would take him to the training bases where the next chapter would begin. The world he entered was smaller, tighter, and far more intimate than anything he had known. The training facilities smelled of diesel, oil, and the sharp metallic tang of new steel. The boats themselves were cramped even when tied to the pier, their interiors a maze of pipes, valves, and narrow passageways where a man had to turn sideways to pass another. On his first visit below decks, Erich felt the air grow thicker almost immediately, the sound of the outside world fading until all that remained was the low hum of machinery and the breathing of the men around him. This was not the open deck of the cruiser with wind and sky. This was a sealed environment where every sound, every movement, every decision carried consequences for everyone inside. The instructors made no effort to soften the reality. They spoke plainly about the margin for error, about how a single mistake in diving procedure or trim could end in disaster, about the absolute necessity of trust between men who could not see each other during critical moments. The training itself tested every layer of a man. There were long hours in classrooms learning the complex systems that kept a boat alive underwater, the delicate balance of ballast, the management of air, the precise timing required for every evolution. But the real lessons happened when the hatches were sealed and the boat began to dive. Erich remembered the first time the deck tilted beneath his feet and the surface disappeared from the periscope. The sudden silence after the diesel engine stopped was almost shocking. In that moment, the only sounds were the faint creaks of the hull adjusting to pressure and the steady breathing of the men around him. He felt his own heartbeat loud in his ears and wondered, briefly, whether he had made the right choice. Then the boat leveled, the systems settled into their rhythm, and the crew around him moved with the quiet competence of men who had already accepted this life. Their calm steadied him. He realized that survival in this environment depended less on individual heroics and more on the invisible web of trust that connected every man to the next. The psychological demands were as intense as the technical ones. The instructors watched for signs of panic, for the small tells that revealed when a man was losing his grip in the confined space. They pushed the trainees with simulated emergencies, sudden loss of power, flooding in a compartment, the need to surface quickly under difficult conditions. Erich found himself in situations where the only way forward was to focus completely on the task in front of him, to shut out the larger fear and do the next necessary thing. In those moments he discovered a reserve of steadiness he had not known he possessed. It was not the absence of fear. It was the ability to keep fear in its proper place while the work continued. The men who struggled most were often those who tried to hide their anxiety rather than acknowledge it and work through it together. The ones who survived the training best were those willing to admit when they were afraid and then rely on the man next to them. Friendships formed quickly in this environment, deeper and faster than on the surface ships. There was no room for pretense when you shared the same narrow bunk space, the same limited air, and the same knowledge that any dive could become the last. Late at night, after the day's drills were finished, small groups would gather in the limited space of the control room or the mess, voices low, sharing stories from home or quiet reflections on the choice they had all made. One evening Erich listened as a fellow trainee spoke of his wife and young child, of the letter he had written that morning trying to explain why he had volunteered without frightening her. The man did not ask for advice. He simply needed to say the words aloud. Erich found himself doing the same in the days that followed, writing letters home that balanced honesty with reassurance, describing the training without the details that would only cause worry. Those letters became anchors. They reminded him that the world above still existed, that there were people waiting who believed in the path he had chosen even if they could not fully understand it. There were moments of unexpected kindness that stayed with him. An instructor who noticed his fatigue after a particularly demanding series of dives and quietly arranged for an extra hour of rest. A more experienced hand who took the time to show him a small trick for equalizing pressure in his ears during rapid depth changes, a gesture passed from one generation of submariners to the next. These were not grand acts. They were the daily currency of men who understood that their lives depended on each other's competence and care. Erich began to see that the U-boat service was not simply about individual daring. It was about a collective resilience built one small act of attention at a time. As the training progressed, the reality of what he had chosen settled deeper into his bones. The boats were not invincible. They were fragile steel tubes balancing on the edge of disaster with every dive. The men who volunteered accepted that the odds of long survival were never in their favor, yet they stepped forward anyway. Some were drawn by the promise of greater responsibility at a younger age. Others sought the purest expression of seamanship, where every decision mattered immediately and visibly. Erich recognized his own motivation in both. The childhood fascination with the sea had evolved into something more mature, a desire to test himself at the furthest edge of what the Navy could ask, to serve in the most demanding environment available. The private fears remained. They surfaced in quiet moments when the boat was surfaced and he could see the open sky again. But those fears no longer controlled him. They had become part of the equation he had already solved when he volunteered. By the time the training period ended, Erich carried a different kind of certainty than the one he had brought from the cruiser. He understood now that the U-boat arm was a world apart, smaller, more intense, bound by an unspoken code that valued competence above all and treated every man's contribution as essential. The steel coffins that waited for them were not romantic. They were demanding, claustrophobic, and unforgiving. Yet within those confines, men discovered a form of brotherhood that few other services could match. The decision to descend into that world had not been made lightly. It had been weighed against every reason to stay on the surface, and the deeper call had won. The men who made that choice carried their private fears and their steady resolve into a service that would ask everything of them. Their willingness to step forward, knowing the cost, deserves to be remembered with the same care and honesty they brought to their duty. Preserving these human stories, the quiet courage, the small kindnesses, the personal reckonings that shaped an entire generation of naval officers, takes real dedication and countless hours of careful work. Supporting this channel with a small tip on Ko-Fi, even just $1, helps sustain the research and storytelling required to bring these forgotten histories to light, just as Erich Topp himself dedicated his later life to preserving honest naval memory. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The young officer who had once stood on the deck of a cruiser and felt the horizon calling now prepared to answer a deeper summons. The wolf's lair waited. He had chosen to enter it with open eyes, carrying the lessons of salt and steel into the silent, dangerous world below. The path ahead would test every quality he had begun to discover in himself. But the decision, once made, felt as natural as the sea itself. The moment he stepped aboard the small coastal boat as its commander, the weight of every life aboard settled onto his shoulders like the cold North Sea spray that never quite left the deck. He had trained for this, volunteered for the deeper challenge, and now the Navy had given him his first command, a compact steel vessel built for the shallow waters and sudden dangers of the early war. The boat felt alive beneath his boots, every creak and hum a reminder that this was no longer training. The crew that greeted him was small, tight-knit, and already bound by the shared knowledge that their world was narrower and more unforgiving than anything on the surface ships. He shook each man's hand, looked into their eyes, and felt the quiet assessment passing between them. They were measuring the new captain as much as he was measuring them. In those first hours, he learned their names, their small habits, the way one man always checked the air valves twice and another kept a worn photograph tucked inside his cap. These were not abstract crew members. They were the men whose survival now depended on his decisions. The first patrols brought a mixture of tension and unexpected success that tested him in ways the training boats never had. There was the long approach on a darkened freighter, the careful calculation of speed and angle while the boat rolled in the swell, and the sudden release when the torpedo left its tube. He stood in the control room with the periscope handles in his hands, watching the distant shape through the glass, feeling the collective breath of the crew held behind him. When the explosion came, distant and muffled through the hull, the boat trembled slightly and a low cheer rose from the men. Yet even in that moment of achievement, he felt no triumph in the usual sense. Later, alone with his thoughts in the cramped wardroom, he found himself wondering about the men on the other ship, whether any had families waiting, whether any had felt the same quiet fear he carried when the sea turned against them. The success was real, but it carried a human cost he could not ignore. He wrote a short letter home that night, describing the patrol in careful, neutral language, saying only that the boat had performed well and the crew was in good spirits. He did not mention the faces he imagined on the sinking vessel. Some things were better left between a man and the sea. Life inside the small boat created its own kind of intimacy and strain. The air grew thick after days submerged, carrying the smell of diesel, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of the batteries. Men moved carefully in the narrow passages, learning to anticipate each other's movements so no one bumped elbows or knocked against valves at the wrong moment. There were nights when the boat surfaced to recharge and the sudden rush of fresh air felt like a gift. Erich would stand on the narrow bridge for a few precious minutes, letting the wind clear his head while the lookouts scanned the darkness. In those moments he sometimes thought of the training on the cruiser, of the open decks and the wide sky, and realized how much he had traded for this tighter, more demanding world. Yet the trade had also brought something valuable, a closeness with his men that felt deeper than anything he had known before. When one of the younger ratings grew quiet and withdrawn after a difficult dive, Erich made a point of sharing a simple meal with him in the tiny galley, asking nothing, simply offering the presence of someone who understood the pressure without needing to name it. Small kindnesses like that held the crew together when the sea grew cruel. The catastrophe arrived without warning on a patrol that had begun like any other. Visibility was poor, the kind of gray, shifting light where sea and sky blurred together and every shadow could hide danger. They were running on the surface to make better speed, the lookouts straining their eyes, when the collision came, sudden, violent, and final. The impact threw men from their feet. Alarms screamed. Water rushed in through ruptured compartments with a roar that drowned out every order. Erich felt the boat lurch violently beneath him, the deck tilting at an angle that told him immediately this was no minor damage. In those first chaotic seconds, fear rose sharp and cold in his chest, not for himself, but for the men who looked to him now in the half-darkness. He forced his voice steady, calling out the orders that might still save lives even if the boat itself was lost. The crew responded with the discipline they had practiced together, moving toward escape routes while water climbed around their legs. There was no time for grand speeches or dramatic gestures. There was only the next hatch, the next valve, the next man who needed a hand up through the rising flood. The boat went down with shocking speed once the end began. Erich found himself in the water, gasping in the cold shock of it, surrounded by the debris and the shouts of survivors. The sea that had been their element now threatened to take them all. He swam toward the nearest men, helping one who was struggling with a life vest, calling out names to account for who had made it out. The cold quickly numbed his hands and feet, but the need to keep others alive kept panic at bay. In the distance, the shape of another vessel appeared through the mist, the one they had struck. For a brief, terrible moment he wondered if rescue would come or if the collision had created enemies instead of saviors. But the men on the other ship threw lines and pulled survivors aboard with urgent hands. There was no celebration, only the grim work of saving whoever could still be reached. Erich climbed the ladder last, turning once to look back at the patch of disturbed water where his first command had vanished. The feeling that settled over him was not defeat in the ordinary sense. It was a profound and private reckoning. He had lost the boat. He had not lost the men who mattered most. In the days that followed, while the survivors recovered in a harbor hospital and the inquiries began, Erich had time to sit with what had happened. He wrote another letter home, this one shorter, saying only that he was safe and that the crew had done everything asked of them. He did not describe the cold water or the moment the deck tilted beyond recovery. Some burdens were his alone to carry. Yet in the quiet hours he allowed himself to examine every decision leading up to the collision, not to assign blame but to understand what the sea had tried to teach him. Command was not simply about successful attacks or bold maneuvers. It was about the constant, exhausting vigilance required to bring men home when everything went wrong. The catastrophe had stripped away any remaining illusions about the margin for error in this service. It had also shown him that resilience was not the absence of loss. It was the willingness to learn from loss and carry the lesson forward without letting it break the spirit needed for the next command. The crew that had survived with him carried their own versions of that same lesson. In the hospital ward, conversations were quiet and spare. Men spoke of small things, a letter they hoped was still waiting at home, a plan for when this war eventually ended, the simple relief of being alive when so many others had not been. Erich listened more than he spoke. He noticed how the shared ordeal had changed the way they looked at one another. The bonds formed in training had been tested in the worst possible way and had held. That knowledge would stay with all of them long after the physical wounds healed. For Erich personally, the loss of U-57 became the first great teacher of his command career. It taught him that even the most careful preparation could be undone by a single moment of poor visibility or misjudged distance. It taught him that the true measure of a captain was not the ships he sank but the men he brought back. And it taught him that survival itself carried an obligation to honor those who had not made it by becoming the kind of leader who might prevent the same tragedy from claiming others. When the Navy gave him his next assignment, the promotion came with the quiet understanding that he had passed through fire and emerged steadier for it. The small coastal boat and its sudden end had been his baptism. The sea had taken his first command, but it had given him something more valuable in return, a deeper respect for the thin line between success and disaster, and a clearer sense of the responsibility that would define every patrol to come. The man who had once carved model ships in a boyhood room now carried the memory of real steel vanishing beneath cold water. That memory would never leave him. It would shape the way he spoke to his next crew, the way he prepared for every dive, and the way he weighed every decision when lives hung in the balance. The cruel sea had offered its first harsh lesson, and he had learned it in the only way that mattered, by surviving it and carrying the cost forward with open eyes. The story of that first command and its sudden end reveals something essential about the men who stepped into these roles early in the war. They carried private fears and quiet hopes into vessels that offered little margin for error, and when catastrophe struck they discovered what they were truly made of. Those personal reckonings, the moments of doubt, the small acts of care between crew members, the long nights of reflection after loss, are the human heart of every naval story from that time. The raw, unfiltered realities of those early patrols, the chaos of sudden disaster, and the resilience that followed deserve to be explored without the usual filters. Joining our Patreon family gives you access to uncensored extended episodes, raw video segments without any blurring, exclusive podcasts with historians, and a vibrant community of fellow history enthusiasts passionate about the real stories behind legends like the Red Devil of the Atlantic. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The young commander who had lost his first boat carried the lesson of that loss into every future decision. The sea had been cruel, but it had also been honest. And in that honesty, he found the foundation for the commander he would one day become. The moment he stepped onto the deck of U-552 and felt the boat shift slightly beneath his boots, as if already testing the man who would now call her home, Erich Topp understood that this vessel had chosen him as surely as he had chosen her. She was larger and more capable than the small coastal boat he had lost, yet she carried the same intimate demands that came with any submarine. The steel felt colder here, the passages narrower in a way that made every movement deliberate. Crew members moved past him with the careful respect reserved for a new captain, their eyes assessing him even as they offered quiet welcomes. He walked the length of her, running a hand along the rail, pausing at the conning tower where the metal still smelled faintly of fresh paint. This was not merely another assignment. This was the boat that would carry his name into the stories men would tell long after the war, though he could not know that yet. All he felt in those first hours was the weight of command settling once more onto shoulders that had already learned how suddenly the sea could take everything away. The crew that greeted him was a mixture of veterans from earlier patrols and younger men still finding their sea legs in this tighter world. He made a point of speaking with each of them individually over the first days, not as a commander issuing orders but as a man who needed to know the people whose lives now rested in his decisions. One rating, a quiet man from a northern fishing village, showed him the small carved figure he kept in his pocket for luck during dives. Another, older and more experienced, spoke plainly about the patrols he had already survived and the friends who had not. Erich listened more than he spoke. He learned their small rituals, the way they stowed their few personal items in the cramped berthing spaces, the careful way they passed each other in the narrow gangways so no one was jostled when the boat rolled. These were not grand gestures of leadership. They were the quiet foundations on which trust would be built when the sea turned hostile and every man needed to know the man beside him would not falter. In those early days alongside the pier, he decided the boat needed a face that matched the spirit he sensed in her. The Red Devil emblem was his idea, painted boldly on the conning tower so that anyone who saw her would know she carried a certain ferocity. The crew took to the task with a mixture of pride and superstition. Some helped mix the paint. Others stood watch while the artist among them worked. When the devil took shape, grinning fiercely against the gray steel, a low cheer rose from the men gathered on deck. It was more than decoration. It was a declaration that this boat and this crew would not go quietly into danger. Erich stood back and looked at the finished work, feeling a private satisfaction he did not fully voice. The emblem made the boat theirs in a way no official designation ever could. From that day forward, when they spoke of her among themselves, they used the name the paint had given her. She had become the Red Devil, and in claiming that identity she had also claimed him. The first patrols tested everything he had learned from his earlier command and everything the sea had tried to teach him when that first boat went down. There was the long, tense approach on a darkened convoy, the careful management of depth and speed while the boat crept closer to its target. He stood in the control room with the periscope pressed to his eye, feeling the collective stillness of the crew behind him. When the torpedoes ran true and the distant explosions reached them through the hull, the men allowed themselves a brief, shared breath of relief. Yet even in success there was no celebration that lasted. Later, in the small space that served as his cabin, Erich sat with the logbook open and thought about the men on the other side of those explosions. He wondered, as he had wondered before, whether any of them had written letters that would now go unanswered. The weight of command was not in the moment of attack. It was in the quiet hours afterward when the boat ran silent and every man had time to remember that they were all playing the same deadly game. There were nights when the sea reminded them how little control any captain truly held. A sudden squall could turn the surface into a confusion of spray and wind, making even routine surfacing feel like a gamble. During one such storm, a younger crewman lost his footing on the wet deck and nearly went over the side. Erich was there in an instant, grabbing the man's arm and pulling him back with a strength born of pure instinct. They stood together for a moment afterward, the wind howling around them, neither speaking. The kindness was simple and wordless, but it passed between them like a promise. Later that night, when the boat had settled again, the young man brought Erich a cup of hot coffee without being asked. These small exchanges became the invisible threads that held the crew together when fear tried to pull them apart. The emotional cost of leadership revealed itself most clearly in the letters he wrote and the ones he received. He kept his own correspondence careful and measured, telling his family that the boat was performing well and the men were in good spirits. He never described the moments when depth charges hunted them or when the hull creaked under pressure that felt far too close. Those details belonged to the sea and to the men who shared them. In return, letters from home brought fragments of a world that continued without him. His mother wrote of ordinary things, the garden and the weather, in a handwriting that grew slightly shakier with each passing month. He read those letters slowly, often more than once, letting the familiar words anchor him before he folded them away. The private fear that sometimes rose in him was not for his own safety. It was the fear that he might fail the men who trusted him, that he might make a decision in the heat of a moment that would cost lives he had come to know so intimately in the cramped spaces of the boat. Yet alongside the fear grew a fierce pride in what they were becoming together. The crew learned to anticipate his commands almost before he gave them. They moved through the boat with the quiet efficiency of men who had accepted the danger and chosen to face it as a unit. During a particularly difficult approach on a well-defended target, when every minute seemed to stretch and the sound of distant escort vessels grew louder, one of the older hands placed a steadying hand on a young rating's shoulder without a word. The gesture was small, almost unnoticed in the tension of the moment, yet it spoke volumes about the bond that was forming. Erich saw it from his position at the periscope and felt something shift inside him. This was no longer simply a collection of men assigned to a boat. This was a crew that had begun to trust one another with the most precious thing they had left to give, their survival. The boat itself became an extension of that trust. He learned her quirks the way a man learns the habits of a living companion. She rolled differently in certain seas. She answered the helm with a particular responsiveness when he needed her to turn quickly. In the quiet hours between watches, he would sometimes stand alone in the control room, listening to the soft sounds of the boat at rest, and feel a sense of ownership that went deeper than any official order. She was his now, in the same way the sea had always been his, and he carried that responsibility with a steadiness that surprised even him. The red devil on the tower had become more than paint. It had become a symbol the crew rallied around when the nights grew long and the risks grew sharper. As the first patrols gave way to a rhythm of departure and return, Erich began to understand that command of this boat was changing him in ways his earlier service had not. The loss of his first command had taught him caution and the cost of mistakes. This new responsibility was teaching him something else, the quiet satisfaction of watching ordinary men rise to extraordinary demands, and the deep personal bond that formed when men shared danger and came through it together. He did not speak of these things often. Leadership in this world was measured less by words and more by the calm with which he met each new challenge. Yet in the rare moments when the boat was safely in harbor and the crew had a few hours of freedom, he would sometimes walk the deck alone at dusk and allow himself to feel the pride that came with knowing this vessel and these men were becoming something formidable. The world they moved through was one of hidden layers and unseen struggles that ran alongside every patrol. While the visible battles played out on the surface and beneath the waves, other campaigns of intelligence and deception shaped the odds in ways no crew could fully see. The men who chose this life stepped into a conflict where courage alone was never enough, where the unseen moves of distant players could turn a promising approach into a trap or open a path that had seemed closed. Those parallel shadows held stories of their own, forgotten operations, quiet heroes, and the silent battles that decided the fate of ships and crews long before any torpedo was fired. If the story of this commander and his boat has drawn you into the human heart of those patrols, then you will find even deeper layers waiting in the hidden campaigns that ran beside them. Signing up for our free email newsletter will bring you the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep-dive articles that uncover the hidden espionage, intelligence battles, and overlooked heroes that ran parallel to the U-boat campaign's top news so well. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The Red Devil had claimed her master, and in doing so she had given him something he had not expected, a sense of belonging that went beyond rank or orders. The boat and her crew had become his in the deepest sense, and he carried that bond with him every time the hatches closed and the sea closed over them. The patrols ahead would test that bond in ways none of them could yet imagine. But the foundation had already been laid in the quiet work of those first weeks, in the small kindnesses, the shared silences, and the fierce pride that came from knowing they faced the Atlantic together. In the cold darkness of the North Atlantic, where the line between neutral waters and open conflict had already begun to blur, a single decision made in the dim light of a submarine's control room sent ripples that would reach far beyond the sea itself. The night had settled heavy over the convoy lanes. Erich Topp stood at the periscope, the rubber eyepiece cold against his face, and watched the distant shapes moving through the swells. The destroyer was clearly visible in the faint moonlight, her silhouette unmistakable even at this range. She was not a merchant ship. She was a warship of the United States Navy, sailing under a flag that still claimed neutrality while her crew escorted British convoys across waters that Germany considered a combat zone. Topp lowered the periscope for a moment and looked around the cramped control room. The faces of his men were pale in the red battle lighting, their eyes fixed on him. No one spoke. The only sounds were the soft hum of the electric motors and the occasional creak of the hull as the boat rode the long Atlantic swells. He knew what the orders allowed and what they did not say outright. He also knew that every man in this steel tube was waiting for him to decide whether this contact would become an attack or simply another shadow that passed in the night. The weight of that decision pressed on him in ways the earlier patrols had not. This was no ordinary merchant target. Striking an American warship carried consequences that reached beyond the immediate explosion and the loss of life. Topp had trained himself to separate the professional calculation from the larger political storm, yet in the quiet moments before he gave the order he felt the human reality of what was about to happen. These men on the destroyer were sailors doing their duty, just as his own crew was doing theirs. Many of them probably had families waiting at home, letters tucked in their pockets, small hopes for a safe return. The same hopes lived inside the men around him now. He gave the order calmly, the way he had learned to give all difficult orders, and the boat responded with the quiet efficiency they had practiced together. Torpedoes were made ready. The approach was adjusted. When the moment came, the launch felt almost routine until the distant sound of the explosion reached them through the water, a low, heavy rumble that vibrated through the hull and left a silence in its wake that no one wanted to break. On the American destroyer, the night had begun like so many others in those tense months. The crew stood their watches, exchanged quiet jokes to ease the boredom, and scanned the darkness for the telltale wake of a periscope or the shadow of a surfaced submarine. Many of them were young, some barely out of training, still carrying the fresh optimism of men who believed their country's neutrality would keep the worst of the war at arm's length. A few older hands had seen enough to know better. They moved through their duties with the steady professionalism that comes from long service, checking life jackets, making sure the depth charge racks were ready, and speaking in low voices about the families they had left behind. One young sailor wrote a short letter to his wife during a quiet moment on watch, folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket with the intention of posting it when they reached port. He never got the chance. When the torpedo struck, the explosion tore through the forward part of the ship with a violence that threw men from their feet and sent a column of water and flame into the night sky. The destroyer began to settle almost immediately, her bow dipping as the sea rushed in through the shattered hull. Men scrambled in the darkness, some helping injured shipmates, others simply trying to reach the open deck before the ship went under. The oil-slicked water was cold and unforgiving. Those who made it into the sea found themselves surrounded by debris and the cries of shipmates who could not swim or who had been trapped below. The few life rafts that floated free quickly became overcrowded. In the chaos, small acts of courage stood out against the larger tragedy. One man gave his life jacket to a younger shipmate who could not swim. Another held onto an injured friend for as long as his strength lasted before the cold took them both. These were not the actions of heroes in the storybook sense. They were the instinctive responses of ordinary men caught in a moment that had been decided miles away by forces they could not control. Back aboard U-552, the mood was subdued even in the aftermath of a successful attack. The crew had done what was asked of them, yet the knowledge that they had struck a ship flying the American flag created a different kind of silence than the usual post-attack relief. Topp moved through the boat, speaking quietly to his men, checking on those who had been at their stations during the approach. He saw the mixture of pride and unease in their faces and understood it because he felt it himself. One of the younger ratings, a man who had joined only a few months earlier, asked in a low voice whether they had just started something bigger than themselves. Topp did not have an easy answer. He told the man that they had followed their orders and done their duty, the same as any sailor in any navy would have done under the same circumstances. The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. Later, alone with the logbook, he wrote the entry in the same steady hand he always used, recording the time, the position, and the result without embellishment. Only when he closed the book did he allow himself a moment to sit with the larger meaning of what had occurred. He thought of the men who had gone into the water, of the families who would receive telegrams in the coming days, and of the political storm that was certain to follow. The sea had no politics, yet the men who sailed upon it were caught in every current the governments of the world created. The news of the sinking reached American shores days later and landed like a blow in living rooms and shipyards across the country. Families gathered around radios, listening to reports that spoke of American lives lost in waters that were supposed to be neutral. Wives and mothers who had been waiting for letters now waited for different news, the kind that arrived in official envelopes and changed everything. In one small town, a mother sat at her kitchen table holding the last letter her son had sent before the patrol, reading the ordinary lines about the weather at sea and his plans for when he came home. She would never receive another. The loss was not abstract. It was personal and immediate, felt in empty chairs at dinner tables and in the sudden silence that fell over neighborhoods when the casualty lists were posted. Yet even in the grief there were moments of quiet resilience. Communities came together to support the families of the lost sailors. Letters of condolence were written by strangers who had never met the men but understood the cost of service. These small acts of human connection could not bring anyone back, but they reminded the grieving that their loved ones had not been forgotten in the larger machinery of war. For Topp and his crew, the days after the attack brought a different kind of reflection. The boat continued its patrol, but the mood had shifted. Men spoke less and worked with a new seriousness, as if the weight of what they had done had settled over the entire vessel. Topp noticed how the younger crew members looked to the veterans for cues on how to carry themselves, and how even the veterans seemed quieter than usual. He made a point of moving through the boat during the long night watches, stopping to share a few words with men at their stations. These were not speeches about duty or glory. They were simple acknowledgments of the shared burden. One evening he found a crewman sitting alone in the forward torpedo room, staring at the bulkhead. The man had a letter from home in his hand that he had not yet opened. Topp sat with him for a while without speaking, simply sharing the space. After a time the crewman folded the letter carefully and put it away. He did not say what was in it, and Topp did not ask. The moment of quiet companionship was enough. It was one of those small kindnesses that passed between men who understood that some things could not be spoken aloud but could be carried together. The incident itself became a symbol almost immediately, though the men who had lived through it experienced it as something far more personal and raw. On one side of the Atlantic, American newspapers carried headlines that spoke of outrage and the breaking of neutrality. On the other side, the German High Command viewed the sinking as a necessary action against an enemy that was already participating in the war without declaring it. Topp existed in the narrow space between those two larger narratives. He had made a professional decision based on the rules of engagement as he understood them, yet he could not escape the human reality that his torpedoes had ended the lives of men who were fathers, sons, and brothers. The private reckoning he carried was not something he discussed with his crew. It lived in the quiet moments when he stood on the bridge during surfaced running and watched the horizon, thinking about the thin line between duty and the larger consequences that no single commander could control. In the weeks that followed, the political tension between the United States and Germany grew sharper, though open war had not yet been declared. Convoys continued to sail. Escorts continued to protect them. Submarines continued to hunt. The men on both sides of that invisible line went about their dangerous work with the same mixture of professionalism and private fear that had always defined life at sea. The sinking of the American destroyer had not changed the fundamental nature of the conflict. It had only made visible what many already sensed, that the war at sea was no longer a distant European affair but something that was drawing the wider world closer with every passing patrol. The courage shown by sailors on both sides of that divide, whether they served under the stars and stripes or the swastika, was the same raw human courage that has defined men at sea in every conflict. They faced the same cold water, the same sudden violence, and the same uncertainty about whether they would ever see home again. That shared experience of duty and sacrifice transcends the flags they sailed under and the political arguments that sent them into harm's way. If the story of this night in the North Atlantic has stayed with you, then you will find a powerful companion in another chapter of naval courage from a different theater of the same war. The acclaimed film Midway brings to life the extraordinary bravery of sailors and aviators who faced their own impossible trials in the Pacific, men who, like those who served in the Atlantic, answered the sea's demanding call when their nations needed them most. It is a stirring tribute that honors the shared legacy of duty and sacrifice across all who served on the oceans during those dark years. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The men who survived that night, whether they climbed from the oil-slicked water or watched from the safety of a submarine's bridge, carried the memory of it for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it openly in later years. Others kept their silence, holding the weight of what they had seen and done in the private spaces where old sailors keep their hardest truths. The sea eventually claimed most of them, as it claims all who sail upon it for long enough. What remained was the story of ordinary men caught in an extraordinary moment, doing their duty as they understood it while the world around them edged closer to a wider and more terrible war. That story belongs to no single nation. It belongs to the men who lived it and to the families who waited for news that sometimes never came. The lights along the American coast glowed like beacons in the night, welcoming the hunters who had crossed an ocean to find easy prey. U-552 slipped through the darkness with the quiet confidence of a boat that had already proven herself in colder, more dangerous waters. Erich Topp stood on the narrow bridge, the wind carrying the faint scent of land even though they were still miles offshore. Behind him the crew moved with a new energy. Word had spread quickly through the boat that they had reached the American coast, and with it came the stories the men had heard in harbors and training bases, stories of brightly lit cities, of tankers sailing alone without escort, of targets so plentiful that a single patrol could change a boat's reputation overnight. Topp listened to the low voices in the control room and felt the mixture of excitement and unease that had settled over his men. He shared the excitement. The long crossing from European waters had been tense and tiring, and the promise of easier hunting was a relief after the constant threat of escorts and aircraft in the mid-Atlantic. Yet beneath the relief was a quieter awareness that this stretch of coast belonged to a nation that still called itself neutral. The men on the ships they would hunt were not soldiers in the formal sense. They were merchant mariners doing their jobs, many of them far from home and carrying cargoes that kept factories and armies running. Topp kept that thought to himself as he gave the order to continue the surface approach. The sea was calm, the night was clear, and the first targets were already visible on the horizon, their lights reflecting off the water like careless invitations. The first sinkings came quickly and with a spectacle that none of them had fully expected. A tanker burning at night was something to see from a distance, but up close it was something else entirely. The flames climbed high into the darkness, turning the water around the ship into a sheet of fire that reflected off the submarine's hull. Topp watched through the periscope as the crew abandoned ship, small figures leaping into the sea or lowering boats that looked fragile against the inferno. On the bridge of U-552 the men cheered at first, the sound carrying up from below in waves of relief and triumph. They had crossed an ocean and found exactly what they had been promised: easy targets, poor defenses, and the chance to strike without the constant fear of counterattack that had defined earlier patrols. Topp allowed the celebration for a few moments before he turned his attention to the next contact. He understood the lift in morale. These men had lived through depth charges and long nights of silent running. They deserved a stretch of good fortune. Yet even as he watched the burning tanker slip beneath the waves, he felt a small, private tightening in his chest. The men in the water were not enemies in the abstract. They were sailors like his own, caught in a war that had reached their own shores while their government still tried to pretend it had not. The pattern repeated over the following nights. Tankers and freighters sailed close to the coast with their lights blazing, following routes they had used for years in peacetime. American defenses were almost non-existent in those first weeks. Coastal cities kept their lights on, and the ships that passed them did the same. Topp and his crew took full advantage. They surfaced under cover of darkness, closed the range, and fired torpedoes or used the deck gun when conditions allowed. Each success brought more cheers from below, more slaps on the back in the cramped mess, and more stories passed from watch to watch about the size of the flames or the way a ship had broken in two. The boat itself seemed to respond to the easier hunting. She handled the coastal waters with a sureness that made Topp proud. He found himself standing on the bridge longer than necessary during surfaced running, watching the distant glow of American cities and feeling the strange mixture of satisfaction and disbelief that this was really happening. The same sea that had nearly taken him and his first command now seemed to be offering gifts. Yet the gifts came with a cost that revealed itself most clearly when the attacks happened at close range. One night they came upon a small coastal steamer making her way alone. The ship was old and slow, her lights clearly visible against the dark water. Topp made the decision to surface and use the deck gun rather than expend a torpedo. It was a practical choice. The range was short, the sea was calm, and the gun crew was ready. As U-552 closed in, the steamer's crew realized what was happening. Men ran along her decks, some heading for the lifeboats, others simply standing in shock as the submarine's gun swung toward them. The first shells struck the superstructure with a sound that carried clearly across the water. Topp watched through binoculars as the ship began to burn. He saw figures jumping into the sea, some wearing life jackets, others not. The gun continued to fire, the shells punching holes in the hull and sending splinters of wood and metal into the night. When the steamer finally rolled over and sank, the water around her was littered with debris and the dark shapes of men clinging to wreckage. Topp gave the order to move on. There was no time to linger. Other ships were nearby, and the risk of being spotted by aircraft or patrol vessels was real even in these poorly defended waters. On the deck of U-552, the gun crew worked in silence after the attack. The usual jokes and boasts were absent. One of the younger men wiped his hands on his trousers again and again, though there was nothing on them. Another stood at the rail staring back at the patch of burning oil that marked where the steamer had gone down. Topp noticed these small signs of unease and understood them. He had felt something similar himself while watching the shells strike home. There was a difference between firing a torpedo from a submerged boat and standing in the open air while men on another ship died in full view. The distance that usually protected a submarine crew from the human cost of their work had been stripped away. In the control room later that night, Topp spoke quietly with a few of the older hands. They did not discuss the ethics of what had happened. They spoke instead about the need to stay sharp, about the possibility that American defenses would improve, and about the importance of bringing the boat and her crew home safely. The conversation was practical, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of something heavier. The men who had cheered the burning tankers were the same men who now sat in silence after seeing the results of their work up close. The psychological toll showed itself in small ways over the following days. Letters home became shorter and more careful. Topp wrote to his family with the same measured tone he always used, describing the boat's performance and the skill of his crew without mentioning the details of any particular attack. He knew his words would be read by people who had no way of imagining the reality he was living. In return, letters from home brought news of ordinary life, weather, family news, small worries that seemed impossibly distant from the deck of a submarine off the American coast. He read them in the quiet hours between watches, letting the familiar handwriting pull him back to a world where men did not watch other men burn. One evening he found a crewman sitting alone in the torpedo room, staring at a photograph he kept in his pocket. The young man had been part of the gun crew during the close-range attack. Topp sat with him for a while without speaking. After a time the crewman put the photograph away and returned to his duties. The moment of quiet companionship was small, but it was one of the ways the boat held itself together when the work grew heavier than any of them had expected. The successes continued, and with them came a growing sense among the crew that they were living through something extraordinary. They had crossed an ocean and found a coast that seemed almost defenseless. Tankers burned in sight of American cities. Freighters went down with cargoes that would never reach their destinations. The men spoke of these victories in the mess and during night watches, their voices carrying a mixture of pride and something closer to disbelief. Topp listened and added his own measured comments when appropriate. He understood the lift in morale. These were the same men who had survived the harsher waters farther east. They deserved to feel the satisfaction of striking back effectively. Yet he also noticed how the tone changed when the conversation turned to the attacks that had happened at close range. Men who had cheered the distant flames grew quieter when they spoke of the figures they had seen jumping into the sea. The contrast stayed with Topp. The sea had given them an opportunity few submarine crews ever received, but it had also shown them the cost of that opportunity in ways that could not be forgotten. As the patrol continued, Topp found himself thinking more often about the men on the other side of the attacks. He imagined the families who would receive news of lost ships and missing sailors. He thought about the young men who had signed on for what they believed would be safe voyages along their own coast, only to find themselves in the middle of a war they had not expected. These thoughts did not change the decisions he made or the orders he gave. They simply lived alongside the professional calculations, a quiet reminder that every success carried a human price. The boat continued to hunt, and the successes continued to mount, but the shadow of those close-range attacks remained. It lived in the silences that fell over the crew after certain patrols, and the way men sometimes stared at the horizon longer than necessary, and in the private reflections Topp allowed himself during the long night watches when the only sounds were the sea and the low thrum of the engines. The realities of those patrols, the burning ships, the men in the water, the moments when the human cost became impossible to ignore. were captured in images and accounts that few outside the service ever saw in full. The raw footage and photographs from those nights, along with the unfiltered memories of the men who lived through them, reveal a side of the war at sea that official reports often softened or left out entirely. An exclusive digital collection now available brings together rare, uncensored photographs, original wartime footage, and veteran accounts from the Battle of the Atlantic that were deemed too raw or restricted for public broadcast, offering a deeper, unfiltered window into the harsh realities faced by men like those aboard U-552. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The patrol eventually turned for home, the boat running low on torpedoes and fuel after weeks of hunting along the American coast. The men who had arrived full of excitement now carried a more complicated set of memories. They had achieved more than most submarine crews could claim in a single patrol. They had also witnessed the results of their work in ways that would stay with them long after the war ended. Topp stood on the bridge during the final surface running and watched the American coast fade behind them. The lights were still bright. The defenses were still weak. But he knew, as did every man aboard, that this stretch of easy hunting would not last forever. The sea had offered them a gift, and they had taken it. What remained was the knowledge that every gift the sea gave came with a price, and that the men who accepted it would carry that price with them for the rest of their lives. In the vast emptiness of the mid-Atlantic, where the horizon seemed to stretch forever and the only company was the endless roll of the sea, the men of U-552 waited in silence for the moment when the mathematics of survival would turn against them. The shift from the easier hunting off the American coast had come gradually, almost without announcement. One patrol ended with the familiar satisfaction of ships burning in sight of land. The next began with orders that pointed them back toward the open ocean, toward the convoy routes where the real struggle for control of the Atlantic was being decided. Erich Topp felt the change in the mood of his crew even before the first contact reports came in. The men who had cheered the bright lights and careless targets now spoke more quietly during watches. They knew what lay ahead. The mid-Atlantic was no place for lone hunters. It belonged to the Wolfpacks, to the coordinated groups of submarines that gathered like shadows around the great convoys carrying food, fuel, and weapons from North America to Britain. Topp stood in the control room as the first faint radio signals arrived, each one a coded piece of information about where the next convoy was forming and how heavily it was guarded. He passed the information to his officers without drama, but he saw the way their eyes met across the small space. Everyone understood that the easy days were over. The sea was about to ask more of them than it had in weeks. Life inside the boat settled into a rhythm shaped by waiting and sudden intensity. The men ate their meals in shifts, crowded around small tables where the smell of coffee and tinned meat mixed with the ever-present diesel and the faint salt tang that never quite left the air. One evening, after a long day of submerged running to avoid aircraft, a young rating carefully divided a small piece of chocolate he had been saving and passed it around without being asked. No one spoke much, but the simple act of sharing something sweet in that cramped, well-scented space carried more weight than any speech could have. Topp accepted his piece with a quiet nod. He had learned that these small gestures mattered more than anyone outside the boat would ever understand. They were the threads that kept men from unraveling when the sea turned against them. The Wolfpack itself was an invisible thing, felt more than seen. Other submarines moved somewhere nearby, their positions known only through the brief, careful radio messages that passed between them. Topp imagined the other boats sliding through the same dark water, their crews listening to the same distant sounds of propellers and hoping for the same chance to strike without being struck in return. When the first contact report came through, the tension in U-552 changed from the dull weight of waiting into something sharper. Men moved to their stations without being told. The boat angled upward as Topp gave the order to surface and close the range. On the bridge the wind cut cold across their faces, but no one complained. They were hunters again, and the target was a line of ships stretching across the horizon like a slow-moving city of steel and cargo. The approach took hours. Topp kept the boat on the edge of visibility, using the darkness and the rolling swells to stay hidden while the convoy plowed steadily eastward. Through the periscope he could see the merchant ships, their decks loaded high with crates and machinery, and the escorts weaving through the formation like watchful dogs. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before every attack, the private calculation of risk and reward that no amount of experience ever made easier. Around him the crew waited in near silence. One man checked and rechecked the settings on his equipment until his hand steadied. Another sat with his back against the bulkhead, eyes closed, breathing slowly the way he had learned to do during long depth charge hunts. These were not dramatic displays of courage. They were the quiet ways men held themselves together when everything depended on staying calm. When the moment came, the attack unfolded in a series of precise, almost mechanical steps that felt anything but mechanical to the men inside the boat. Torpedoes were made ready. The boat turned to present the best firing angle. Topp gave the order in the same steady voice he always used, and the crew responded with the practiced efficiency that had become their second nature. The sound of the torpedoes leaving their tubes was followed by a long, tense silence broken only by the faint pinging of distant sonar. Then came the explosions, distant and heavy, vibrating through the hull like distant thunder. On the bridge Topp watched columns of water rise among the merchant ships. One vessel began to list almost immediately. Another slowed and fell out of formation. He felt no triumph in that moment, only the cold satisfaction of a job done and the immediate need to get his boat clear before the escorts reacted. The escorts came quickly. Depth charges began to fall in patterns that shook the boat and sent men staggering against the bulkheads. The lights flickered. Pipes groaned under the pressure. In the control room Topp kept his voice level as he gave orders to change depth and course, trying to slip away from the worst of the barrage. Around him the crew did their work without panic, though he could see the strain in their faces. One young man's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted a valve, but he kept working. Another reached over without a word and steadied the valve for him until the shaking stopped. These small acts of quiet support happened in the middle of the chaos, unnoticed by anyone except the men directly involved. They were the everyday heroism that never made it into official reports but kept the boat alive when the sea tried to kill it. Hours passed before the escorts finally moved away. The boat surfaced in the darkness to recharge batteries and let the crew breathe air that did not taste of fear and diesel. Topp climbed to the bridge and stood for a long time looking out at the empty sea. Somewhere in the distance other submarines were still hunting the same convoy. Somewhere else, men on damaged merchant ships were fighting to keep their vessels afloat or struggling into lifeboats. He thought about the letters that would soon be written on both sides of the Atlantic, the ones that would carry news of survival or loss to families who had no way of knowing the mathematics that had decided their loved ones' fates. He thought about his own crew, about the way they had held together through the depth charges and the long silence afterward. When he went below again, he stopped to speak with a few of the men who had been at their stations longest. He did not offer praise or speeches. He simply asked how they were holding up and listened to their short, tired answers. The conversations were brief, but they mattered. They reminded every man that he was not alone in carrying the weight of what they had done and what they still had to face. The patrols continued in this pattern for weeks. Convoy after convoy moved across the mid-Atlantic, and the Wolfpacks gathered around them like predators circling a herd. Some attacks succeeded. Others ended with nothing but wasted torpedoes and the need to run deep while escorts hunted overhead. The mathematics of the tonnage war played out in real time inside the boat. Every ship sunk was another calculation in the larger struggle over whether Britain could be starved into submission or kept alive by the steady flow of supplies. Topp understood the larger picture, but he never let it become abstract. He saw it in the faces of his men after every depth charge attack, and the way they wrote their letters home with hands that still trembled from the explosions. And in the quiet way they checked on one another during the long submerged hours when the only sound was the distant pinging of sonar searching for them. One night, after a particularly close call that had left the boat leaking from several small seams and the crew exhausted, Topp found a letter tucked into his small personal space. It was from his family, written in the careful handwriting he knew so well. He read it slowly, letting the ordinary details of home life pull him away from the constant pressure of command. When he finished, he folded it carefully and put it away. Later he wrote his own letter, keeping the tone steady and reassuring without mentioning the details of the patrol. He knew the censors would read it, but more than that, he knew his family needed to believe he was still the same man who had left them. The act of writing became its own small ritual of resilience, a way of holding onto the world beyond the steel hull and the endless sea. The peak of the tonnage war tested every quality the men of U-552 possessed. They lived with the constant awareness that their survival depended on a shifting set of calculations no single person could fully control. A well-placed torpedo could sink a ship carrying vital supplies. A single depth charge could end everything for the boat and her crew. Between those extremes lay the long hours of waiting, the shared meals, the quiet conversations, and the small kindnesses that reminded them they were still human beings rather than simply components in a larger machine of war. Topp watched his men endure these conditions with a growing respect that went beyond professional duty. He saw ordinary sailors become something more through the simple act of continuing to do their jobs when everything around them tried to break them. He saw the same quality in himself on the nights when exhaustion and fear pressed close and he chose to walk the boat one more time, speaking quietly to the men on watch, making sure no one felt forgotten in the darkness. These were the human calculations that decided whether a submarine crew survived the peak of the tonnage war. The larger mathematics of ships sunk in tonnage delivered mattered to admirals and governments. Inside the boat, survival depended on something quieter and more personal. It depended on men who could share a piece of chocolate without being asked, who could steady a trembling hand on a valve during a depth charge attack, who could write letters home that carried hope even when they had little left to give. It depended on a commander who understood that leadership in such conditions was measured not by dramatic orders but by the steady presence that reminded every man he was not facing the sea alone. The men who lived through those mid-Atlantic patrols carried the memory of them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of the tension and the fear. Others remembered the small moments of connection that made the fear bearable. All of them understood that what they had endured was part of a larger story of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, doing their best to survive while the mathematics of war played out around them. Those personal stories of resilience and quiet courage deserve to be remembered with the same care and honesty that the men themselves brought to their duty. Preserving these human histories, the letters, the small kindnesses, the private reckonings that shaped an entire generation, takes real dedication and countless hours of careful work. Supporting this channel with a small tip on Ko-Fi, even just $1, helps sustain the research and storytelling required to bring these forgotten histories to light, just as Erich Topp himself dedicated his later life to preserving honest naval memory. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The mathematics of survival in those convoy battles never offered easy answers. Every patrol brought new calculations of risk and reward, new moments when the sea reminded the men of U-552 how narrow the margin between life and death had become. Yet within that narrow margin they found ways to remain human. They found them in the shared watches and the quiet conversations, and the letters that connected them to the world they were fighting to protect, and in the steady leadership that turned a collection of individuals into something stronger than any single man could be alone. The tonnage war would eventually turn against them, but the human lessons learned in its peak would stay with them long after the last convoy had crossed the Atlantic. The sea that had once offered easy victories now seemed to conspire against them, turning every patrol into a test of whether skill and luck could outweigh the growing weight of the odds stacked against them. Erich Topp felt the change almost as soon as they left the French coast on that first patrol of the new year. The boat moved through familiar waters, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. The men spoke less during the long submerged hours. When they did talk, their voices carried an edge that had not been there during the easier months off the American coast. Topp stood in the control room and watched his crew go about their duties with the same outward steadiness he had come to expect, but he saw the small signs that told a different story. A young rating checked the same valve 3 times before moving on. Another sat with his back against the bulkhead during a quiet moment, staring at nothing, his fingers tracing the edge of a letter he had not yet opened. These were the quiet ways fear showed itself when there was no room for open panic. The first sign that the sea had turned came without warning. They had been tracking a convoy for 2 days, staying just outside the range of the escorts, waiting for the right moment to slip inside the formation. The weather was poor, with low clouds and a heavy swell that made periscope work difficult. Topp had just given the order to close the range when the lookout on the bridge shouted a warning. An aircraft appeared out of the low clouds directly above them, its engines already in a dive. There had been no radar warning, no distant sound of propellers growing steadily louder. One moment the sky was empty, and the next the plane was there, its bombs already falling. The boat crash-dived with a violence that sent men staggering. Depth charges followed almost immediately, exploding so close that the hull rang like a struck bell. Topp gripped the periscope handles to steady himself and gave the orders that might still save them. The crew responded with the discipline they had always shown, but he could see the new tightness in their faces. This was not the patient hunting they had known. This was something colder and more precise, as if the enemy had learned to see in the dark. In the hours that followed, while they ran deep and silent, Topp moved through the boat checking on his men. He stopped beside a young torpedo man who had joined only a few months earlier and asked quietly how he was holding up. The man tried to smile, but his hands were still shaking from the explosions. Topp did not offer empty reassurances. He simply stayed for a moment, sharing the space and the silence, letting the young man know he was not facing the fear alone. Later, when the immediate danger had passed and they surfaced to recharge, one of the older hands brought Topp a cup of hot coffee without being asked. The gesture was small, almost nothing in the larger scheme of the war, yet it carried the weight of everything they were enduring together. These were the quiet threads that held the crew together when the sea tried to pull them apart. The losses began to mount in ways that could no longer be ignored. One evening they received a brief radio message about another boat from their flotilla that had failed to return. The message gave no details, only the name and the fact that she was overdue. Topp read it in the small space that served as his cabin and felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with every such report. He had known the commander of that boat. They had shared meals in port and spoken of their crews during the rare moments when the war allowed ordinary conversation. Now that man and his men were simply gone, swallowed by the same ocean that was growing more dangerous with every passing week. Topp folded the message carefully and put it away. He did not mention it to the crew immediately. They would hear soon enough, and he wanted them to have one more night of whatever peace they could find. The next patrol brought a different kind of test. They found a convoy, but the escorts seemed to know exactly where they were almost from the moment they approached. Depth charges fell in patterns that suggested the enemy could track them even when they believed themselves hidden. The boat shook with each explosion, and the lights flickered as pipes groaned under the strain. In the control room, Topp kept his voice steady as he gave the orders to change depth and course, trying to slip away from the worst of the barrage. Around him the crew did their work with grim determination. One man reached over and steadied a younger crewmate whose hands had begun to shake on the valve wheel. The gesture was quick and wordless, but it spoke of the quiet resilience that had become their only real defense. Hours passed before the escorts finally moved on. When the boat finally surfaced in the darkness, the men climbed to the bridge in small groups, breathing the cold air as if it were the first clean breath they had taken in days. Topp stood alone for a while after the others had gone below. He looked out at the empty sea and thought about the men who had not been as fortunate. He thought about the families who would receive telegrams in the coming weeks, the wives and parents who would never know exactly what had happened to their loved ones. He thought about his own crew, about the way they had held together through the long hours of fear and noise. The private fear he carried was not for himself. It was the fear that he might fail them, that he might make a decision in the heat of a moment that would cost lives he had come to know so intimately in the cramped spaces of the boat. He had learned long ago that command in these conditions was measured less by dramatic orders and more by the steady presence that reminded every man he was not facing the sea alone. The patrols grew shorter and more desperate as the months passed. Boats that had once returned with stories of successful attacks now limped back with damage and empty torpedo racks. In the harbors, the mood had changed. Men who had once spoken with confidence about the coming victory now spoke in quieter voices about simply surviving the next patrol. Topp saw the change in the faces of his own crew when they returned to port. The young men who had joined full of excitement now carried a different kind of steadiness, the kind that came from having looked death in the face and found a way to keep going. He made a point of speaking with each of them individually during the brief time in harbor, not as a commander issuing orders but as a man who understood what they were carrying. These conversations were rarely long. They were the small kindnesses that reminded everyone they were still human beings rather than simply components in a larger machine of war. One evening, after a particularly difficult patrol that had ended with the boat damaged and 2 men injured, Topp found a letter waiting for him. It was from his family, written in the careful handwriting he knew so well. He read it slowly in the quiet of his small cabin, letting the ordinary details of home life pull him away from the constant pressure of command. His mother wrote of the garden and the weather. His father mentioned a neighbor who had asked after him. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that no official message ever could. When he finished reading, Topp folded the letter carefully and put it away. Later he wrote his own letter, keeping the tone steady and reassuring without mentioning the details of the patrol. He knew his family needed to believe he was still the same man who had left them. The act of writing became its own small ritual of resilience, a way of holding onto the world beyond the steel hull and the endless, dangerous sea. The sense of being hunted rather than hunting grew stronger with every patrol. Aircraft appeared where none should have been. Escorts seemed to anticipate their movements with an accuracy that felt almost personal. Topp and his men adapted as best they could, changing their tactics, running deeper, staying silent for longer periods. Yet the losses continued. Another boat from their group failed to return. Then another. In the flotilla headquarters, the maps on the wall showed fewer and fewer boats at sea. The men who remained spoke less about victory and more about simply bringing their crews home. Topp felt the weight of this change most clearly when he stood on the bridge during surfaced running and watched the horizon for threats that now seemed to come from every direction. The sea that had once been their element had become a place where every wave might hide an enemy and every cloud might bring sudden death from above. Yet even in the midst of this desperation, the men of U-552 found ways to endure. They found them in the shared watches and the quiet conversations during lulls in the action. They found them in the small acts of kindness that passed between them without fanfare. One night, after a long period of submerged running that had left everyone exhausted, a crewman brought Topp a piece of bread he had been saving. The man did not say why. He simply handed it over and returned to his station. Topp accepted it without comment, understanding that the gesture mattered more than the bread itself. These were the human threads that kept the crew from unraveling when everything around them tried to break them. They were the quiet heroism that never made headlines but made survival possible when survival itself had become the only victory left to claim. The year wore on, and the struggle for the Atlantic grew more one-sided with every passing week. Topp watched his men grow thinner and quieter, their faces lined with the strain of constant vigilance. He saw the same look in the mirror when he shaved in the small basin that served as his only private space. Yet he also saw something else in their eyes when they looked at him during the worst moments. They looked to him for the steady presence that reminded them they were not facing the sea alone. That responsibility weighed on him more heavily than any depth charge. He carried it by continuing to do his job with the same calm professionalism he had always shown, by speaking quietly to frightened men, by making the small decisions that kept the boat moving forward even when every instinct told him to turn back. In the quiet hours between watches, Topp sometimes allowed himself to think about what this war was doing to the men who fought it. He thought about the young sailors who had joined full of dreams of adventure and now carried the weight of too many close calls. He thought about the older hands who had seen too many friends disappear and now spoke of home with a longing that had not been there before. He thought about himself, about the commander he had become through the long months of success and the longer months of loss. The private reckoning he carried was not something he discussed with his crew. It lived in the quiet moments when he stood alone on the bridge and looked out at the sea that had once been his ally and had now become something far more dangerous. The desperate struggle of 1943 tested every quality these men possessed. It stripped away the illusions of easy victory and left only the raw reality of survival in a battle that had turned against them. Yet within that harsh reality they found ways to remain human. They found them in the letters from home that connected them to the world they were fighting to protect. They found them in the small kindnesses that passed between them during the worst moments. They found them in the quiet resilience that allowed ordinary men to keep doing extraordinary things even when the odds had turned against them. These were the human stories that defined the year when the hunters became the hunted, stories of fear and courage, of loss and endurance, of men who refused to break even when everything around them tried to break them. The personal cost of that year would stay with Topp and his men long after the war ended. Some would speak of it openly in later years. Others would carry it in silence, holding the weight of what they had seen and done in the private spaces where old sailors keep their hardest truths. What remained was the knowledge that they had faced the worst the sea and the enemy could throw at them and had found ways to keep going. That knowledge would shape everything that came after, including the decisions Topp would make when the war finally asked one last, impossible thing of him and his crew. The raw, unfiltered realities of those desperate months, the sudden losses, the narrow escapes, the quiet moments of human connection that made survival possible, deserve to be explored without the usual filters. Joining our Patreon family gives you access to uncensored extended episodes, raw video segments without any blurring, exclusive podcasts with historians, and a vibrant community of fellow history enthusiasts passionate about the real stories behind legends like the Red Devil of the Atlantic. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The sea had turned against them, but the men of U-552 had not turned against each other. In that simple fact lay the only victory still available to them in a year when every other measure of success had slipped away. They endured because they had learned to carry both the fear and the duty together, one day and one patrol at a time. The desperate struggle of 1943 would eventually give way to something even darker, but the human lessons learned in its depths would stay with them long after the last torpedo had been fired. He stood on the deck of the sleek new submarine and felt, for the first time in months, a flicker of something that resembled hope, the kind that comes when men are given machines that promise to rewrite the rules of the sea. The boat was unlike anything Erich Topp had commanded before. Where earlier submarines had felt like steel coffins built for endurance and stealth, this one carried an almost graceful line. A design born from the urgent need to outrun and outdive the hunters that now filled the skies and the surface of the Atlantic. The crew that gathered around him on the pier spoke in low, excited voices as they pointed out the streamlined hull and the strange new fittings that allowed the boat to draw air while running just beneath the waves. Topp listened without interrupting. He had been summoned from the desperate patrols of the previous year and told only that he was needed for something new, something that might yet change the balance beneath the sea. Now, standing before this vessel, he understood why the orders had come with such quiet urgency. This was not merely another boat. This was an attempt to give men like him and the crews they led a fighting chance in waters that had grown steadily more lethal. The transition to command felt both familiar and strangely distant. He had spent years learning the intimate rhythms of smaller, older submarines, the way they creaked under pressure and the precise dance of valves and ballast that kept them alive. This new boat demanded a different kind of intimacy. Its systems were more complex, its power plant more demanding, its very shape a declaration that the old rules of underwater warfare no longer applied. Topp walked the decks with his new officers, asking questions that revealed both his experience and his willingness to learn alongside them. The men responded with the cautious respect reserved for a commander who had survived long enough to be given something this important. One young engineering officer, barely out of training, showed him the battery compartments with a mixture of pride and nervousness, explaining how the increased capacity would allow the boat to remain submerged for far longer periods. Topp nodded, asked about the practical limits of recharging underway, and noticed the way the officer's shoulders relaxed when he realized his commander was not there to test him but to understand. Training the crew became its own quiet battle against time. The men who had come from older boats carried habits that no longer served them. They moved too cautiously through passages designed for speed. They hesitated at controls that responded with a smoothness the older boats had never possessed. Topp spent long hours in the control room during simulated dives, watching the way his team adapted, offering corrections in the same calm voice that had steadied crews through depth charge attacks in previous years. There were moments of frustration, of course, a missed sequence during an emergency drill, a valve left in the wrong position that sent a ripple of tension through the compartment. In those moments he would stop the exercise, gather the men, and speak not of failure but of the margin that now existed between life and death in these faster, deeper waters. The lessons were technical, but the delivery was human. He reminded them that every man's life depended on the next man doing his job without hesitation, and that the boat itself, magnificent as it was, could not save them if they lost faith in one another. The first time they took the boat to sea, the sense of possibility was almost tangible. The hull cut through the water with a responsiveness that made the older boats feel lumbering by comparison. When they submerged and ran on the new electric propulsion, the silence inside the pressure hull felt different, less like hiding and more like moving with purpose through a medium that had once belonged entirely to the enemy. Topp stood at the periscope during one of the early trials and watched the surface world slip past at speeds that would have been impossible only months earlier. For a brief stretch of hours, the men allowed themselves to believe that the tide might yet be turned. They spoke of longer patrols, of reaching convoy routes that had previously been too heavily defended, of returning to the kind of hunting that had defined the earlier years of the war. Topp listened to these conversations in the mess and said little. He felt the same lift in morale, the same dangerous spark of renewed purpose. Yet beneath it ran a quieter current of doubt that he kept to himself. He had seen too many patrols end in sudden disaster to place his full trust in any machine, no matter how advanced. The first real test came during a patrol that began with the same mixture of tension and guarded optimism that now marked every departure. They slipped out under cover of darkness, the new boat handling the coastal waters with an ease that surprised even the most experienced hands. Once clear of the shallows, Topp ordered a deeper dive and increased speed, feeling the hull respond with a smoothness that made the older boats seem like relics. For a time the patrol felt almost like a return to earlier days. They located a small convoy, closed the range with a speed that would have been suicidal in previous boats, and prepared to attack. The torpedoes ran true. 2 merchant ships took hits and began to settle. The escorts reacted more slowly than Topp had come to expect, giving the boat time to slip away before the depth charges began to fall. In the control room, the crew exchanged glances that carried the first real spark of victory they had felt in months. One man clapped another on the shoulder. A quiet cheer rose and then faded as discipline reasserted itself. Topp allowed the moment. These men had earned it. Yet the success proved fragile. Within hours, the escorts had been reinforced by aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere, their search patterns too precise to be explained by chance alone. The boat was forced deep and kept there for long, exhausting stretches while the enemy methodically worked the area. The new battery capacity helped, but even it had limits. Air grew stale. Men moved through their duties with the careful economy of those who understood that every breath counted. Topp rotated watches with extra care, making sure no one remained at a station long enough for exhaustion to dull their reactions. He stopped beside a young rating who had been on duty for too many consecutive hours and spoke quietly about the need to rest when the chance came. The young man nodded, eyes red-rimmed, and Topp saw in that simple exchange the same quiet resilience he had witnessed in earlier crews under far worse conditions. The technology had changed. The human cost had not. As the patrol continued, the gap between promise and reality widened. The boat's speed allowed them to evade several attacks that would have been fatal in an older vessel, yet each escape came at a price in battery power and in the growing fatigue of the crew. They attempted another approach on a different convoy and found the escorts waiting with a coordination that suggested they had been expected. Torpedoes were fired, but the results were inconclusive. The boat was driven deep again, and this time the depth charges fell with a persistence that tested every system and every man. In the control room, Topp kept his voice level, giving orders that bought them inches of safety when feet would have been better. Around him, the crew worked with the grim determination of men who had learned that survival was no longer a matter of bold attack but of endurance. One of the older hands reached over during a particularly close pattern of explosions and adjusted a setting on a younger man's panel without a word. The small act of experienced care passed almost unnoticed in the noise and vibration, yet it was one of the threads that kept the boat alive. When they finally surfaced in the darkness and began the long run back toward base, the mood inside the pressure hull had shifted once more. The early excitement had given way to a quieter understanding. The new boat was remarkable. It could do things no previous submarine had managed. Yet the war it had been built to fight had already moved beyond the point where any single class of vessel could turn the tide. Topp stood alone in the small space that served as his cabin and allowed himself to feel the weight of that realization. He thought about the men who had cheered the first successful attack and who now moved through their duties with the careful economy of survivors. He thought about the families waiting at home, the letters that would arrive with news of this patrol and the next, and the growing gap between what those letters could say and what the men actually lived. He thought about the larger war, about the land campaigns that were steadily shrinking the territory from which these boats could operate, and about the simple, brutal arithmetic that no amount of engineering could overcome. The transfer to a second boat of the same class came with new orders and a renewed, if more guarded, sense of purpose. U-2513 carried the same sleek lines and the same promise of underwater superiority. Topp brought with him the lessons learned from the first boat and a crew that had begun to trust both the machine and one another in ways that had not been possible in the older vessels. The early days of the new command carried echoes of the earlier hope. They conducted trials that demonstrated the boat's capabilities with a clarity that left even the most skeptical officers impressed. Topp watched his men adapt to the new systems with the same quiet pride he had felt when first taking command of U-5 52 years earlier. There were moments of genuine satisfaction, a successful high-speed submerged approach during an exercise, a flawless emergency dive that would have been impossible in previous boats. These moments reminded everyone that the technology itself was not at fault. The problem lay in the timing, in the fact that these vessels had arrived in numbers too small and at a moment when the larger war had already tilted beyond recovery. The patrols that followed carried the same mixture of capability and futility. The boat could reach areas that older submarines could never have approached without detection. It could remain submerged longer and move faster when discovered. Yet every success was measured against the growing reality that the convoys they hunted were better protected than ever, that the aircraft they evaded were only the visible edge of a system that now seemed to know their movements before they left port. Topp found himself in the familiar position of balancing the needs of his crew against the demands of a war that offered fewer and fewer opportunities for meaningful action. He continued to lead with the same steady professionalism that had defined his earlier commands, but the private reflections that came in the quiet hours between watches carried a different tone. He wrote letters home that spoke of the boat's performance and the skill of his men without mentioning the growing sense that even these magnificent machines could not alter the outcome that now seemed inevitable. One evening, after a patrol that had ended without contact and with the boat forced to run deep for most of its duration, Topp sat with one of his officers in the small wardroom. The conversation was quiet, almost casual. They spoke of the boat's handling, of the improvements that might come with more time and more boats of the same class. Neither man mentioned the larger war or the shrinking chances of meaningful success. Yet the silence that fell between them carried its own weight. When the officer finally excused himself to check on his watch, Topp remained for a while longer, staring at the bulkhead as if it might offer answers it could not give. He thought about the men sleeping in their bunks, about the families who waited for news, and about the simple, human truth that no machine, however advanced, could shield them from the consequences of a war that had already been lost on too many fronts. The electric promise of these boats had been real. They represented the best that engineering and desperation could produce in the final months of a long conflict. Yet the bitter reality that accompanied every patrol was that they had come too late and in numbers too small to change what was already decided. Topp carried that knowledge with the same quiet resolve he had shown through every previous command. He did not speak of it to his crew. He simply continued to do the work of keeping them alive and ready for whatever the next patrol might bring. The men responded in kind. They adapted to the new boat, trusted its capabilities where they could, and relied on one another for the rest. In the small acts of kindness that passed between them during the long submerged hours, a shared ration, a quiet word of encouragement, a steadying hand during a close call, they found the only victory still available to them. The war would end soon, one way or another. Until then, they would continue to do what men in their position had always done, endure, adapt, and hold on to whatever fragments of hope the sea and the machines allowed them. The technological race that produced these boats had run alongside the visible battles of the Atlantic in ways few outside the service ever fully understood. Hidden developments, secret priorities, and the quiet work of engineers and crews had created vessels that might have changed everything had they arrived earlier and in greater numbers. Those parallel efforts, the forgotten operations and overlooked contributions that shaped the final months of the war at sea, formed their own hidden history. If the story of these advanced boats and the men who took them to sea has drawn you deeper into the human side of the conflict, then you will find even richer layers waiting in the hidden campaigns that ran beside them. Signing up for our free email newsletter will bring you the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep-dive articles that uncover the hidden espionage, intelligence battles, and overlooked heroes that ran parallel to the U-boat campaigns Topp knew so well. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The electric promise had been real. The bitter reality had been unavoidable. Between those two truths, the men of these boats lived out the final months of their war, carrying both the wonder of what their machines could do and the quiet knowledge of what they could no longer change. Topp would carry that same mixture into the final chapter that still waited for him and for the boat that had become, in its own way, both his last hope and his final test. The orders came in fragments now, broken by static and the growing silence from a homeland that was itself falling apart, and on the bridge of U-2513 Erich Topp read them with the same steady calm that had carried him through years of war. The boat moved through waters that felt increasingly empty, as if the sea itself had begun to withdraw from the conflict. The crew went about their duties with the mechanical precision of men who had long since stopped expecting victory. They checked the batteries, adjusted the trim, and stood their watches in shifts that blurred one into the next. Yet beneath the routine there ran a current of something new, not quite hope, not quite despair, but a quiet awareness that the end was no longer a distant possibility but a presence that traveled with them. Topp felt it most clearly in the small silences that fell during meals in the cramped wardroom. Men who had once spoken of home with longing now spoke of it with a different kind of distance, as if they were already preparing themselves for the possibility that the homes they remembered might no longer exist when they returned. One young rating kept a letter from his mother tucked inside his shirt pocket and read it so often that the paper had begun to soften at the creases. He never spoke of its contents, but the way his fingers traced the edges during quiet moments told Topp everything he needed to know about the weight the young man carried. The final patrols were exercises in endurance rather than aggression. Orders still came to hunt, to attack, to disrupt the flow of supplies that now poured toward the European mainland from every direction. Topp took the boat out because that was what he had been trained to do, because the alternative was to leave his crew idle in harbors that were themselves under increasing threat from the air. They found few targets worth the risk. Convoys moved with heavy escorts now, and the aircraft that patrolled the skies seemed to appear with an accuracy that left little room for surprise. On one patrol they closed on a small formation of supply ships only to be driven deep by a sudden and persistent air attack that lasted through the night. The depth charges fell in patterns that suggested the enemy knew exactly where they were. The boat shook with each explosion, and the men braced themselves against bulkheads while Topp gave the orders that might yet buy them another hour of life. When the attack finally eased, he moved through the compartments checking on his crew. He found one man sitting with his head in his hands, breathing in short, sharp gasps that had nothing to do with the stale air. Topp placed a hand on his shoulder and stayed until the breathing steadied. No words were exchanged. The gesture was enough. In the days that followed, the radio messages grew more fragmented and more urgent. The voices on the other end spoke of collapsing fronts and retreating armies, of cities that no longer existed in any recognizable form. Topp listened in the control room with the same outward composure he had always maintained, but he felt the ground shifting beneath the entire structure of the war he had known. The men around him sensed it too. Conversations that had once revolved around tactics and targets now turned to questions that had no answers. What would happen to them if the fighting stopped? Where would they go if there was no navy left to serve? Topp answered what he could and let the rest stand in silence. He had no comfort to offer that would not ring false. The only certainty he could give them was that they would face whatever came together, as they had faced every depth charge and every failed attack since the beginning. The news that the war in Europe had ended reached them as a series of broken transmissions that left more questions than answers. Some of the messages spoke of unconditional surrender. Others urged continued resistance. Topp gathered his officers and read the clearest versions aloud, his voice steady even as the words settled over the room like a weight none of them had been prepared to carry. The men listened without interruption. When he finished, no one spoke for a long time. The silence was not shock so much as a slow absorption of something that had been approaching for months but had never quite felt real until it arrived. Topp dismissed them to their duties and remained in the control room alone for a while, staring at the chart that showed their position far from any friendly port. He thought about the years that had brought him to this moment, the early patrols in small coastal boats, the successes off the American coast, the desperate struggles of the mid-Atlantic, the brief promise of the advanced boats that had arrived too late. He thought about the men who had served under him and the ones who had not returned. He thought about the families who would receive news of this ending and the ones who would receive no news at all. The private reckoning he allowed himself was not one of regret or triumph. It was simply the acknowledgement that a chapter had closed and that whatever came next would be shaped by forces far larger than any single commander or any single boat. The decision to surrender was not made in a single moment but in a series of small, necessary steps. Topp consulted with his officers and with the senior petty officers who had kept the boat running through every crisis. They spoke of the risks of continuing, the likelihood that any further action would only result in the loss of more lives for no purpose. They spoke of the men who had families waiting and of the simple human truth that survival had become the only victory still within reach. Topp listened to each of them in turn. He weighed their words against the orders that still crackled through the radio and against the professional code that had guided him since his first days in uniform. In the end, the choice was clear. He gave the order to surface and to make for the nearest port where they could formally lay down their arms. The crew received the news with a mixture of relief and uncertainty that mirrored his own. Some men shook hands with one another in the passages. Others sat quietly with their thoughts. One older hand carefully folded a photograph of his children and placed it back in his pocket with a gentleness that spoke of everything he had held onto through the years. The approach to the British forces was made in daylight, the white flag flying from the periscope as they had been instructed. Topp stood on the bridge with a small group of officers, watching the shapes of the escort vessels grow larger on the horizon. The sea was calm, the sky clear, and the moment carried none of the drama that stories of surrender sometimes invent. It was simply the end of one long journey and the beginning of another that none of them could yet see. When the British boarding party came alongside, the men who climbed onto the deck did so with a professional efficiency that carried its own kind of respect. There were no shouted orders or displays of triumph. The senior British officer spoke briefly with Topp on the bridge, their conversation limited to the practical matters of securing the boat and arranging for the crew to be taken ashore. In those few minutes of exchange, Topp felt something he had not expected, a recognition that passed between men who had fought on opposite sides of the same unforgiving sea. They had both known the weight of command, the responsibility for lives that depended on decisions made in the dark and under pressure. That shared understanding required no words. It existed in the way they stood together on the deck of a boat that had once been an instrument of war and was now simply a vessel waiting to be taken into custody. The crew was assembled on deck before they were transferred. Topp walked among them one last time, speaking quietly to those who needed it, making sure the injured were cared for, and offering what reassurance he could about what lay ahead. He did not promise them an easy future. He promised only that they had done their duty as they understood it and that no man among them had anything to be ashamed of in the eyes of the service they had joined. The men listened with the same steady attention they had always given him. Some shook his hand. Others simply nodded. The small moments of connection that had sustained them through years of war now served to mark its end. When the last of them had been taken off the boat, Topp remained for a few minutes longer, standing alone on the bridge where he had spent so many nights watching for threats that no longer mattered. He placed his hand on the rail and felt the familiar texture of the metal beneath his fingers. Then he turned and followed his crew into whatever future awaited them on the other side of surrender. The emotions that accompanied those final hours were more complicated than any single word could capture. There was relief, certainly, the kind that comes when a long and dangerous journey finally reaches its conclusion. There was also a profound sense of loss, not only for the comrades who had not lived to see this day but for the purpose that had defined their lives for so long. Uncertainty hung over everything. None of them knew what captivity would bring or what kind of Germany they would eventually return to, if they returned at all. Topp carried these mixed feelings with the same quiet discipline he had always shown. He thought about the boy who had once carved model ships and dreamed of the sea. He thought about the commander who had taken a small coastal boat into its first patrols and who had later stood on the deck of a vessel that carried the hopes of an entire navy. He thought about the men who had trusted him with their lives and about the families who had waited through years of silence. The private fears he allowed himself were not about his own future but about whether the service he had given had been worth the cost it had exacted from so many. He had no clear answer. He had only the knowledge that he had done what the sea and the circumstances had asked of him, and that he had tried, in every decision, to bring as many of his men home as the war would allow. The courage shown by sailors on every side of that long conflict had always been the same raw human courage, the willingness to face the sea and the enemy with whatever strength and skill they possessed. Whether they served under one flag or another, whether they returned home in victory or in defeat. They had all known the same cold nights on the bridge, the same tension of waiting for the next attack, and the same quiet relief when another patrol ended without disaster. That shared experience of duty and endurance transcended the political arguments that had sent them to sea. It belonged to the men themselves and to the families who had waited for them. If the story of these final days, the surrender of a boat and a crew who had given everything they had, has stayed with you, then you will find a powerful companion in another chapter of naval courage from a different theater of the same war. The acclaimed film Midway brings to life the extraordinary bravery of sailors and aviators who faced their own impossible trials in the Pacific, men who, like those who served in the Atlantic until the very end, answered the sea's demanding call when their nations needed them most. It is a stirring tribute that honors the shared legacy of duty and sacrifice across all who served on the oceans during those dark years. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The white flag had been raised. The boat that had carried Topp through the final desperate months now belonged to others. The men who had served on her would soon be scattered into whatever future the peace allowed. For Topp himself, the surrender marked not an ending but a transition into a life he could not yet imagine. He had given the best years of his service to the sea. He had lost friends and comrades. He had known both the exhilaration of success and the weight of failure. Now, standing on the deck of a surrendered vessel under a foreign flag, he carried only the quiet knowledge that he had done his duty as he understood it and that the sea, which had claimed so much from so many, had at least allowed him to bring this final crew through to the end. The war was over. The story of what came next would be written in a different language, on different shores, by a man who had once looked at the horizon and answered its call without knowing where it would lead. He stepped onto the soil of a Germany he barely recognized, the weight of surrender still heavy on his shoulders and the sea that had defined his life now nothing more than a distant memory carried in the salt still clinging to his clothes. The journey back had been long and strangely quiet. After the formal surrender of U-2513, Topp and his crew had been processed through a series of holding areas where British and later American officers asked the same careful questions again and again. There was no cruelty in the process, only the methodical sorting of men who had once been enemies into categories the victors could understand. Topp answered as he always had, with the steady professionalism that had carried him through years of command. He spoke of his duty to his crew, of the decisions he had made to bring as many of them home as possible, and of the simple fact that he had served the Navy of his country as it existed when he joined it. The officers listened, took notes, and moved on to the next man. In those early weeks of captivity, Topp found himself watching his former crew with a new kind of attention. Some of the younger men seemed almost relieved to be finished with the war. Others carried a hollow look that suggested they were not yet ready to believe the fighting had truly ended. He spoke quietly with each of them when the opportunity arose, offering the same calm presence that had steadied them during depth charge attacks. The small kindnesses that had kept the boat alive at sea now served to keep spirits from breaking in the uncertainty of defeat. When the time came for him to return to Germany, Topp traveled in a crowded transport with other former officers and men. The landscape that unfolded outside the windows was one of ruin and exhaustion. Cities that had once stood proud now lay in broken heaps of brick and twisted steel. Bridges had been shattered. Roads were cratered and barely passable. People moved through the wreckage with the slow, careful steps of those who had learned to expect nothing more than survival from one day to the next. Topp sat in silence for much of the journey, his eyes taking in scenes that no amount of radio reports or whispered rumors had prepared him to see. He thought of the letters he had written home during the war, the careful words meant to reassure his family that he was still alive and still fighting. He wondered what those same family members had endured while he had been at sea. The private fear that rose in him was not for himself, but for what he would find when he finally reached them. He had left as a commander of men. He would return as one more survivor in a nation of survivors. The first days on German soil brought a different kind of test than any he had faced at sea. There were no orders to give, no watches to stand, no enemy to hunt or evade. Instead, there was only the daily struggle to find food, to locate a place to sleep, and to begin piecing together what remained of a life that had been built around service. Topp sought work where he could find it. For a time he worked as a fisherman, taking a small boat out into coastal waters that felt both familiar and strangely empty without the constant threat of aircraft or escorts. The physical labor of hauling nets and mending lines gave his hands something to do while his mind tried to adjust to a world without war. In the early mornings, before the sun rose, he would stand on the deck of the little fishing vessel and watch the horizon the way he had once watched it from the bridge of a submarine. The sea had not changed. It still rolled with the same patient indifference it had always shown. Yet everything else had. The men who worked alongside him were not trained sailors but ordinary people trying to feed their families in a broken economy. They spoke little of the past. When they did, it was in short, careful sentences that avoided the larger questions of who had been right and who had been wrong. Topp listened more than he spoke. He found a strange kind of peace in the simplicity of the work, and the knowledge that at the end of the day he would have helped bring in food that someone, somewhere, would eat. It was not command. It was not glory. It was simply useful. The process of denazification arrived like another kind of patrol, one that required him to account for every decision and every association in ways that felt both necessary and deeply personal. Topp sat in small rooms with Allied officers who asked about his membership in the party, about the oaths he had sworn, and about the nature of the service he had given. He answered honestly. He had joined the Navy because he had wanted to serve at sea. He had risen through the ranks because he had proven himself capable of leading men in difficult circumstances. He had never been a member of the political party in any active sense, though he understood that simple denial would not be enough. The officers listened, took notes, and sometimes pressed for more detail. In those moments Topp felt the full weight of being judged not only for what he had done but for what others had done in the name of the same uniform. He spoke of his efforts to protect his crews, of the times he had chosen the survival of his men over orders that would have led to unnecessary loss. He spoke of the sea itself, of the way it had shaped every choice he had made since the first day he had stepped aboard a submarine. The process was exhausting in a way that combat had never been. It required him to put into words feelings and convictions that had always lived in action rather than explanation. Yet he endured it with the same quiet resilience that had carried him through the worst patrols. He understood that this, too, was part of coming home. In the months that followed, Topp moved through a series of temporary jobs and temporary homes, each one a small step away from the identity of U-boat captain and toward something he had not yet defined. He carried with him the invisible. Wounds that so many veterans carried, the nights when sleep would not come because the mind still listened for the sound of approaching aircraft, the moments when a sudden noise would send his body into the automatic responses of a man who had spent years expecting attack. He did not speak of these things often. When he did, it was in short conversations with other former servicemen who needed no explanation. They understood the language of shared experience without requiring long descriptions. One evening, after a long day of physical work, Topp sat with a man who had served in the army on the Eastern Front. They shared a simple meal and spoke of the sea and the land in the careful way that veterans sometimes do, each recognizing in the other the same mixture of pride and loss. The kindness in that conversation was not dramatic. It was the simple act of two men acknowledging that they had both survived something that had changed them in ways words could never fully capture. The determination to rebuild came slowly and from unexpected places. Topp began to think about what skills he might offer in a world that no longer needed submarine commanders. He had always been good with his hands, with the precise work of keeping complex machines running under pressure. He had learned to read charts and to calculate courses through uncertain waters. These were not skills that translated directly into civilian life, yet they represented a foundation of discipline and attention to detail that could be applied elsewhere. He started to study again, using whatever books and courses he could find in the shattered educational system. The work was difficult. His mind, so long focused on immediate survival and tactical decisions, struggled at first with the slower pace of academic thought. Yet he persisted. Each small success, a completed assignment, a concept understood, became its own quiet victory. He wrote occasional letters to his family, keeping the tone measured and forward-looking even when the reality around him felt anything but certain. In those letters he described the work he was doing and the people he was meeting without dwelling on the past. He understood that his family needed to see him as someone who was moving forward, not as someone forever defined by the war he had fought. The emotional consequences of defeat and homecoming revealed themselves in unexpected moments. There were days when the sight of a ruined building would bring back memories of ships burning on the horizon. There were nights when the silence of a room felt heavier than the noise of a submarine running deep. Topp learned to carry these moments without letting them define him. He found strength in the small acts of everyday heroism that surrounded him, neighbors helping neighbors clear rubble, strangers sharing food when there was little to share, families rebuilding homes one brick at a time. These were not the grand gestures of wartime courage. They were the quieter, more persistent forms of resilience that allowed a broken nation to begin putting itself back together. Topp participated in these acts when he could. He helped clear debris from a street near where he was staying. He shared what little he had with others who had even less. In doing so, he began to understand that the service he had given at sea had prepared him for this different kind of duty, the duty of rebuilding rather than destroying, of creating rather than commanding. The long walk home was not a single journey but a series of small steps that gradually transformed a U-boat captain into a civilian survivor. It was a path marked by uncertainty and by the quiet determination to find purpose in a world that no longer had a place for the skills he had mastered. It was a path walked by millions of other veterans who carried their own invisible wounds and their own private reckonings. Topp moved along it with the same steady professionalism that had defined his years at sea. He did not expect easy answers or quick redemption. He expected only to keep putting one foot in front of the other until the path led somewhere new. The sea had taught him that survival was never guaranteed and that every day above the surface was a gift earned through vigilance and care. He applied those lessons now to the different battlefield of post-war life. The battles were quieter. The enemies were hunger, despair, and the weight of memory. Yet the requirement was the same, to endure, to adapt, and to bring as many people through as possible. The harsh realities of those first post-war years, the ruined cities, the struggle for basic survival, the long process of rebuilding both a nation and a sense of self, were captured in images and accounts that few outside Germany ever saw in full detail. The raw photographs of returning veterans, the unfiltered stories of men who had once commanded submarines and now fished for food or cleared rubble, and the veteran testimonies that spoke of both pride and profound loss formed a hidden archive of what it meant to come home from that particular war. An exclusive digital collection now available brings together rare, uncensored photographs, original wartime footage, and veteran accounts from the Battle of the Atlantic that were deemed too raw or restricted for public broadcast, offering a deeper, unfiltered window into the harsh realities faced by men like those aboard U-552. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The man who had once stood on the bridge of U-552 watching for enemies now stood on the broken streets of his homeland watching for any small sign that life might yet be rebuilt. The transition was neither clean nor complete. It would take years and many more small steps before Erich Topp found the path that would eventually lead him back to the sea in a very different capacity. But the foundation was being laid in those first difficult months, in the physical work of fishing, in the patient endurance of denazification, and the quiet determination to study and to serve in whatever way a changed world would allow. The long walk home had begun. And though he could not yet see the end of it, he walked with the same steady resolve that had carried him through every patrol and every surrender. The sea had let him go. Now the land would have to teach him how to stay. In the quiet hours after the day's labor, when the ruins of the old world still cast long shadows across the streets, Erich Topp spread out sheets of paper on a simple wooden table and began to draw the outlines of a future he could not yet see. The decision to study architecture had come slowly, born from the same steady discipline that had once guided him through submarine patrols. After the long months of fishing and the exhausting process of denazification, he had found himself restless in a way that physical work alone could not ease. The sea had taught him precision and the weight of responsibility, but it had also left him with a deep awareness of how quickly structures could be destroyed. Now, in a Germany reduced to rubble, he felt a quiet pull toward creation rather than command. Architecture offered something the Navy never had, the chance to build rather than to hunt, to shape spaces where people might live and heal rather than simply survive. He enrolled in courses with the same focused attention he had once brought to learning the trim of a new boat. The textbooks felt foreign at first, filled with terms for load-bearing walls and spatial harmony instead of periscopes and ballast tanks. Yet the underlying logic of careful planning and respect for forces beyond one's control felt familiar. He studied late into the nights, often by the light of a single lamp, his hands tracing lines that would one day become homes and offices where families could gather without fear. The early years of study were marked by small, persistent acts of resilience. Many of his fellow students were also veterans, men who carried their own invisible burdens from the Eastern Front or the Air War. They shared classrooms with younger students who had known only the final, desperate months of the conflict. In those shared spaces, conversations sometimes turned to the past, but more often they focused on the practical work of learning how to draw a stable foundation or calculate the stresses on a beam. Topp found a quiet camaraderie in this environment. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult critique of his first design project, a younger student quietly offered him a cup of weak coffee and a few words of encouragement. The gesture was simple, yet it reminded Topp that rebuilding was not a solitary endeavor. He accepted the kindness with a nod and returned to his drawing board, determined to improve the next attempt. These moments of mutual support sustained him through the long hours of study and the lingering doubts about whether a former submarine commander could truly find a place in this new civilian world. As his skills grew, so did his sense of purpose. Architecture became more than a profession, it became a way of processing the destruction he had witnessed and participated in during the war. When he designed his first small residential building, he thought carefully about how families might move through the spaces, where children might play safely, and how natural light could reach into corners that had once been left in shadow. The work demanded precision and foresight, qualities he had honed at sea, but it also required imagination and empathy for the people who would eventually live within his creations. He found himself lingering over details that might seem minor to others, the placement of a window that could offer a view of a garden, the width of a hallway that allowed two people to pass without brushing shoulders. These choices felt like small acts of redemption, quiet contributions to a society struggling to emerge from the ruins. In the evenings, after classes or early drafting work, he would sometimes walk through the streets of the city where he studied, observing how people were already beginning to clear debris and stack bricks by hand. The sight stirred something in him. He was no longer merely surviving, he was learning to create. It was during these years of study and early professional work that Topp met the woman who would become his wife. Their first encounters were ordinary, born of shared circumstances in a time when ordinary connections felt precious. She had also lived through the war years, though her experiences had unfolded on the home front amid bombings and shortages. They spoke at first of practical things, the cost of materials, the difficulty of finding reliable work, the small hopes for a more stable future. Over time, the conversations deepened. Topp found himself able to speak, in careful and measured words, about the weight he still carried from his years at sea. She listened without judgment, offering the kind of steady presence that allowed him to acknowledge the past without being consumed by it. Their courtship unfolded slowly, marked by small kindnesses rather than grand gestures. He would bring her sketches of buildings he admired, and she would share stories of neighbors helping one another rebuild after air raids. When they married, it was a quiet ceremony attended by a few close friends and family members who had survived the war. The event felt less like a celebration of new beginnings and more like a quiet affirmation that life could still hold meaning and connection after so much loss. Fatherhood arrived soon after and brought with it a different kind of emotional reckoning. The birth of his first son filled Topp with a mixture of profound joy and private fear. He held the infant with hands that had once gripped the periscope handles of a submarine and felt the same careful responsibility he had once carried for an entire crew. Yet this was a different command, one rooted in tenderness rather than tactics. He worried, in the quiet hours of the night, whether the experiences of war had left him too hardened or too distant to be the father his children needed. He wondered what stories he would one day tell them about his past and how he might explain the choices he had made. These private fears did not paralyze him. Instead, they sharpened his determination to create a stable and loving home. He approached fatherhood with the same methodical care he brought to his architectural drawings, learning through trial and small errors how to soothe a crying child or share a moment of wonder over a simple toy. His wife stood beside him through these early years, offering quiet strength during the sleepless nights and the moments when memories from the sea surfaced unexpectedly. Together they built a family life that stood in gentle contrast to the world Topp had known during the war, a world of confined steel spaces and constant vigilance now replaced by the ordinary rhythms of shared meals, bedtime stories, and the steady growth of two sons. The professional path he chose also became a vehicle for healing. As Germany began its slow economic recovery, Topp found opportunities to contribute to reconstruction projects. He worked on designs for housing that could accommodate displaced families and on public buildings meant to serve communities rising from the ashes. Each completed project brought a quiet satisfaction that went beyond professional achievement. When he walked through a finished structure and saw people moving through spaces he had helped shape, he felt a sense of contribution that eased some of the lingering weight of his wartime service. The architecture he practiced was not grandiose or symbolic in an obvious way. It was practical, human-scaled work focused on creating places where ordinary life could resume. In this focus he found a form of personal redemption. The same mind that had once calculated attack angles and escape routes now calculated how sunlight might fall across a child's bedroom or how a family might gather comfortably around a dinner table. The contrast was not lost on him. It served as a private reminder that even after years of destruction, the capacity to build remained. There were moments when the past intruded despite his best efforts to move forward. A sudden sound resembling a depth charge might cause him to pause mid-sentence during a meeting with clients. A letter from an old naval comrade could bring back memories of men who had not lived to see this new chapter. Topp learned to acknowledge these intrusions without allowing them to dominate his days. He spoke of them occasionally with his wife, who offered the patient listening that helped transform private burdens into shared understanding. He also found solace in the act of drawing itself. The clean lines and measured proportions of architectural plans provided a sense of order that the chaotic final years of the war had denied him. In the careful geometry of his designs, he discovered a quiet form of resilience, the ability to impose structure and beauty on a world that had once seemed defined only by loss and uncertainty. His two sons grew up in a household shaped by both the lingering presence of the past and the deliberate creation of a new future. Topp made a conscious choice not to shield them entirely from his history, but to share it in ways appropriate to their ages and understanding. He spoke of the sea and the men he had served with, emphasizing the bonds of duty and camaraderie rather than the violence of combat. When his sons asked difficult questions about the war, he answered honestly but without burdening them with details that might weigh too heavily on young shoulders. The family outings they took together, walks through parks that were slowly recovering from wartime damage, visits to construction sites where buildings were rising, became opportunities for quiet teaching. Topp would point out how a foundation was laid or how a roof was framed, using the language of building to convey lessons about patience, planning, and the value of creating something lasting. His sons absorbed these lessons in their own ways, growing up with a father who had known both the depths of the ocean and the heights of reconstruction. The personal renaissance Topp experienced during these years reflected a broader transformation unfolding across the new Federal Republic. Many former officers and servicemen were finding their own paths to reintegration, some through business, others through teaching or public service. The process was neither uniform nor easy. It required individuals to confront the moral complexities of their past service while contributing to a society committed to democratic principles and peaceful reconstruction. Topp's journey into architecture and family life embodied this larger story in deeply human terms. He did not seek public recognition or dramatic gestures of atonement. Instead, he focused on the daily work of building, literally and figuratively, a life and a legacy that stood apart from the uniform he had once worn. The quiet heroism of these years lay in the persistence of ordinary effort, the late nights spent over drafting tables, the patient guidance given to his sons, the steady presence he offered his wife during times when memories surfaced. These acts accumulated into something substantial, a foundation strong enough to support the next chapters of his life. As the years passed and his professional reputation grew, Topp continued to carry the lessons of both his naval service and his civilian reinvention. The discipline and attention to detail he had developed at sea served him well in the precise world of architecture. The emotional resilience forged through years of command and loss helped him navigate the challenges of family life and personal healing. He remained a private man, more comfortable with the quiet satisfaction of a completed building or a child's laughter than with public reflection on his past. Yet those closest to him understood that his later contributions to Germany were rooted in a profound desire to help build a nation worthy of the sacrifices so many had made, even if those sacrifices had sometimes been made in service of a cause he could no longer fully endorse. The blueprints he drew were not merely technical documents. They were, in their own way, statements of hope that better structures could rise from the wreckage of the old. The dedication Topp showed in rebuilding his own life and contributing to the reconstruction of his country mirrors the quiet commitment required to preserve the human stories of that era for future generations. Just as he turned his skills toward creating lasting spaces for families and communities, preserving the honest memory of those who served requires ongoing care and attention. Supporting this channel with a small tip on Ko-Fi, even just $1, helps sustain the countless hours of deep research and careful storytelling required to bring these forgotten human histories to light, just as Erich Topp himself dedicated his later life to preserving honest naval memory. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the years that followed, Topp would be called back to serve his country once more, this time in a Navy reborn under democratic principles. But the foundation for that return was laid in the quiet years of study, family, and architectural work. The man who had once commanded a submarine through the most dangerous waters of the war had learned to command something equally vital, the patient, persistent work of building a life worth living after the guns fell silent. His blueprints extended beyond paper and ink. They shaped the future he helped create for his family and for the nation he had come to serve in a new and different way. The long journey from U-boat captain to civilian architect was complete, and the next chapter waited just beyond the horizon he had once watched so carefully from the bridge. The letter arrived on an ordinary morning, bearing an invitation that would pull him back across the years to a world he thought he had left behind forever. Erich Topp had built a life of quiet purpose in the years since the war. His days were filled with the precise work of architecture, with the steady rhythms of marriage and the growing presence of two sons whose laughter filled rooms that had once held only the silence of a man learning to live without command. The sea still called to him in private moments, a walk along a riverbank, the scent of salt on a coastal breeze. But he had learned to answer that call with the measured discipline of a civilian who had once lived by different rules. Then the letter came, formal and unexpected, from the new West German Navy that was slowly taking shape under the watchful eyes of allies who had once hunted men like him. It asked if he would consider returning to uniform, not as a commander of war but as an officer in a democratic force committed to defense and alliance. Topp read the words several times before setting the page down. His wife watched him from across the room, sensing the shift in the air without needing to ask what the letter contained. In the quiet conversation that followed, he spoke of duty and of the strange pull of unfinished business, while she listened with the patient strength that had steadied their family through years of rebuilding. Neither pretended the choice was simple. The past still lived in the small silences between them, and the future they had carefully constructed now faced an unexpected test. The decision to accept carried weight that extended far beyond professional ambition. Topp had spent years proving to himself and to others that a man could serve his country without serving the ideology that had once consumed it. Returning to the Navy meant stepping back into an institution that carried the shadow of that earlier time, even as it tried to forge something new. He weighed the invitation against the faces of his sons, against the steady work of his drafting table, against the private peace he had found in creating rather than destroying. Yet the call was not only from the Navy. It was from the sea itself, and from the knowledge that the skills he had honed in the most dangerous waters might now serve a different purpose, helping to build a force that could stand alongside former enemies in the defense of peace. When he finally wrote his reply, the words came with the same calm precision he had once used to log a patrol. He would come, but he would come as the man he had become, not as the officer he had once been. The first days back in uniform felt both familiar and disorienting. The cloth carried a different cut, the ranks a different meaning, and the men around him were mostly younger, shaped by a Germany that had learned hard lessons from defeat. Topp reported to his first posting with the quiet professionalism that had always defined him, yet he noticed the glances that followed him, some curious, some respectful, a few carrying the cautious distance of those who wondered what a former U-boat commander might bring to this new service. He met those glances with steady eye contact and the same measured courtesy he extended to everyone. In the mess and during training exercises, he listened more than he spoke at first, learning the rhythms of a navy that answered to a parliament rather than a single leader, that trained for deterrence rather than conquest. One evening, after a long day of drills, a young lieutenant approached him with a hesitant question about a tactical decision from the war years. Topp answered honestly, without defensiveness, and then asked the lieutenant what he would have done in the same situation. The conversation stretched late into the night, and by its end something small but real had passed between them, the beginning of trust built not on shared glory but on shared honesty about difficult choices. Family life absorbed the change with its own quiet adjustments. Topp's wife managed the household with the same steady hand she had used through the lean post-war years, yet she noticed the way old habits resurfaced, the precise folding of uniforms, the early rising even on leave, the way his eyes still scanned the horizon during family outings to the coast. Their sons, now old enough to understand something of their father's past, asked careful questions at the dinner table. Topp answered them with the same care he had once given to briefing a crew. He spoke of duty and of the difference between serving a nation and serving a cause that had gone terribly wrong. He did not shield them from the complexity. Instead, he let them see that a man could carry both pride in his professional skill and sorrow for the larger context in which that skill had been used. One afternoon, his older son brought home a school assignment about the new Navy and asked his father to look it over. Topp read the pages slowly, then sat with the boy and explained how the Kriegsmarine was trying to learn from the past without being trapped by it. The conversation became one of those small, ordinary moments of connection that stitched their family life together even as the uniform once again claimed a portion of Topp's days. As the years passed, his rise through the ranks felt less like ambition and more like the natural extension of the qualities he had always carried. Superiors noted the calm authority he brought to exercises, the way he could steady a tense situation with a few measured words, the depth of experience that allowed him to anticipate problems before they fully formed. He mentored younger officers with the same patient attention he had once given to training a green crew in the cramped confines of a submarine. In one memorable instance, during a joint exercise with Allied forces, a difficult navigation problem arose that threatened to derail the entire operation. Topp stepped in quietly, drawing on instincts honed in waters far more dangerous than any training area, and guided the team to a solution that preserved both safety and the exercise's objectives. Later, in the wardroom, several officers from other nations approached him with genuine respect. One, an American captain whose father had served in the Atlantic during the war, offered a handshake and a simple statement, "You know the sea the way we do." The moment carried no grand reconciliation, only the quiet recognition between professionals who had once been on opposite sides of the same unforgiving element. The posting to Washington as part of the NATO Military Committee marked a deeper crossing. Topp arrived in the United States carrying the full weight of his history and the quiet determination to serve the new alliance with the same integrity he had brought to every previous command. The city felt vast and open after the confined world of submarines and the careful reconstruction of post-war Germany. He moved through briefings and meetings with the same steady presence that had once steadied men under depth-charge attack. Yet the emotional complexity of the role was never far from the surface. He sat across tables from officers whose nations had once hunted the boats he commanded, and he did so without defensiveness or false humility. In one extended conversation with a British admiral whose ship had once been part of the escort forces in the Atlantic, the talk turned, almost inevitably, to the shared experience of command at sea. They spoke of the cold mathematics of survival, of the weight of decisions made in the dark, of the men who had not come home. Neither man sought absolution. What passed between them was simpler and more enduring, the recognition that the sea had tested them both and that professional respect could exist even across the lines of former enmity. Family life continued in parallel, sustained by letters that crossed the ocean with the same careful words Topp had once used to reassure his parents during the war. His wife wrote of the boy's progress in school, of small household triumphs and worries, of the steady rhythm of a life that now included both the absence of a husband at sea and the presence of a father whose service had taken on a new meaning. Topp wrote back with descriptions of the work, with questions about the children's interests, with the quiet affection of a man who had learned that the strongest bonds are often maintained through ordinary attention rather than dramatic gestures. When leave allowed, he returned to Germany and slipped back into family routines with the same adaptability that had once allowed him to shift from hunter to hunted and back again. His sons, now young men themselves, watched their father navigate this second chapter with a mixture of pride and curiosity. One evening, after a long conversation about the differences between the Navy he had known and the one he now served, the younger son asked simply whether his father was happy. Topp considered the question for a long moment before answering that happiness was not the right word. He was useful, he said. He was contributing to something that might help prevent the kind of war he had once fought. That, for now, was enough. The promotion to flag rank came with the same quiet professionalism that had marked every step of his return. There was no public celebration, only the steady acknowledgement from superiors and peers that his experience and judgment had earned the additional responsibility. Topp accepted the rank with the same measured response he had given to every previous advancement. He understood that the uniform he now wore represented not only his own service but the larger reconciliation of a nation that had chosen democracy and alliance over the isolation and aggression of the past. In private moments he reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from the boy who had once carved model ships, through the years of war and defeat, through the patient work of rebuilding a civilian life, and now back into uniform in service of a Germany that was learning to stand with rather than against its former enemies. The private fears he had carried, that his past would forever define him, that the skills of war had no place in peace, had been answered not by denial but by the daily evidence that professional competence and moral clarity could coexist. The years in Washington deepened both his professional contribution and his personal understanding of reconciliation. He worked alongside officers from nations that had once been locked in the most brutal conflict the world had known, and he did so with the same focus on the mission that had always defined his service. There were moments of genuine connection, shared meals where stories of the sea were exchanged without the need to relive old battles, joint planning sessions where the collective memory of loss served as motivation to build stronger defenses against future conflict. Topp found himself able to speak, when asked, about the lessons he had learned from both success and failure at sea. He did so without glorifying the past or minimizing its cost. The men and women who listened heard not a former enemy but a fellow sailor who had survived the same element and emerged with a commitment to preventing its worst uses. In that shift lay the quiet redemption of his return to service. As his time in uniform drew toward its close, Topp carried with him the accumulated weight of 2 distinct chapters of service and the civilian years that had connected them. He had answered the call once as a young man shaped by the ambitions and failures of his nation. He had answered it again as a mature officer who had learned that the highest form of duty sometimes meant serving a different Germany alongside the very nations that had once opposed it. The emotional complexity of that journey remained private, shared only with his family and with the few close colleagues who understood the full arc of his life. Yet the contribution he made was visible in the steady professionalism he brought to every posting, in the mentoring of a new generation of officers, and in the living example that a man could carry the past without being imprisoned by it. The deeper stories of men like Topp, the private reckonings, the quiet acts of reconciliation, the long process of turning experience into service for a different kind of peace, often remain hidden beneath the larger sweep of history. Those personal layers of courage and adaptation deserve to be explored without filters or simplification. Joining our Patreon family gives you access to uncensored extended episodes, raw video segments without any blurring, exclusive podcasts with historians, and a vibrant community of fellow history enthusiasts passionate about the real stories behind legends like the Red Devil of the Atlantic. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the time came to set the uniform aside for the final time, Topp did so with the same steady calm that had carried him through every previous transition. He had answered the call not once but twice, and in doing so he had helped write a small but meaningful chapter in the larger story of a nation learning to serve peace rather than conquest. The sea that had claimed so much from him had also given him the skills and the perspective to contribute to something larger than any single war or any single defeat. The man who stepped away from active service carried both the weight of what he had seen and the quiet satisfaction of what he had helped to build. The next chapter would unfold away from the uniform, yet the lessons of command, of resilience, and of measured reconciliation would travel with him into whatever future remained. The letter that summoned him to Washington carried no fanfare, only the quiet weight of an assignment that would place a former Kriegsmarine commander at the very center of an alliance once forged against everything he had once served. Erich Topp arrived in the American capital with the measured stride of a man who had already crossed oceans in far more dangerous circumstances. The city unfolded around him in wide avenues and imposing buildings that spoke of power held in different hands than those he had known. He moved through the initial briefings and introductions with the same steady professionalism that had once steadied crews beneath depth charges. Yet beneath that calm surface ran currents of private reflection. He was here not as a conqueror or even as a simple guest, but as a representative of a Germany that had chosen a new path. The irony was not lost on him. Men who had once hunted his kind now sat across conference tables discussing joint strategy. Officers whose nations had lost ships to his torpedoes now listened when he spoke of submarine tactics. Topp carried these contradictions without dramatizing them. He had learned long ago that the sea rewarded those who adapted rather than those who clung to old enmities. The daily work of integration revealed itself in small, human exchanges rather than grand declarations. In one early meeting, an American admiral whose own service had included Atlantic convoy duty asked Topp directly about the limitations of older U-boat designs under sustained air attack. The question was professional, not accusatory. Topp answered with the same precision he had once used to log a patrol, describing the constant pressure of aircraft that could appear without warning and the narrow margins that decided survival. Around the table, other officers leaned in. Some had lost ships to submarines like the ones Topp had commanded. Others had hunted those same boats. What emerged from the exchange was not confrontation but a shared recognition of hard-won lessons. Later, in the corridor, the same admiral offered a brief handshake and a quiet comment that the knowledge Topp brought might help prevent the next generation from repeating old mistakes. Topp accepted the gesture without elaboration. He understood that reconciliation in this setting was measured not in speeches but in the willingness to learn from one another's scars. Private moments revealed the deeper emotional layers of his posting. In the evenings, after long days of briefings, Topp would sometimes walk the streets of Washington alone, letting the unfamiliar rhythm of the city settle around him. He thought of his wife and sons back in Germany, of the letters that crossed the ocean with careful accounts of daily life. He wrote back with descriptions of the work, of the strange comfort found in contributing to an alliance that stood against the very aggression he had once been part of. These letters became anchors. They reminded him that the man who now advised on collective defense was still the same husband and father who had once rebuilt a life from the ruins of defeat. The private fear that occasionally surfaced was not of professional failure but of being forever defined by a single chapter of his past. He countered that fear with the daily evidence of his usefulness. When a joint planning session turned on questions of undersea endurance and detection, his experience proved directly relevant. Younger officers from multiple nations asked for his perspective not out of curiosity about an old enemy but because the knowledge he carried could strengthen the alliance they now served together. The personal growth that accompanied this work showed itself in unexpected ways. Topp found himself able to speak, when asked in private settings, about the human cost of the war he had fought. He did so without seeking absolution and without minimizing the consequences of actions taken under orders he had once accepted. In one extended conversation with a British officer whose ship had once been part of the escort forces Topp had evaded, the talk turned to the shared reality of command at sea. Both men had known the weight of decisions made when lives hung in the balance. Both had seen comrades disappear beneath the waves. What passed between them was not forgiveness in any formal sense but a quieter recognition that the sea had tested them both and that professional respect could survive even the bitterest history. Topp carried that conversation with him for days afterward. It became one of those small, private markers of the bridge he was helping to build. Family connections remained vital threads across the distance. Topp's wife managed the household with the same steady resilience she had shown through the lean post-war years. Their sons, now young adults, wrote letters that mixed pride in their father's new role with questions about the country he was now serving alongside. Topp answered each one with care, describing the collaborative nature of the work and the quiet satisfaction of contributing to a structure meant to prevent the kind of conflict that had once consumed their nation. When leave allowed visits home, he slipped back into family rhythms with the adaptability that had once allowed him to shift between hunter and hunted. These reunions reinforced the deeper purpose of his posting. The man who advised on NATO submarine doctrine was also the father who wanted his children to inherit a Europe where former enemies stood together rather than against one another. The educational dimension of his role emerged naturally through the work itself. Topp helped shape discussions on how a reintegrated German Navy could contribute to collective defense without reviving old fears. He spoke from experience about the strengths and vulnerabilities of undersea forces, lessons paid for in lost boats and lost crews. Younger officers from across the alliance absorbed these insights not as historical curiosities but as practical knowledge that could inform current planning. The presence of a former Kriegsmarine ace in these rooms served as living proof that professional competence could transcend the divisions of the past. Topp never framed his contributions in dramatic terms. He simply offered what he knew, answered questions with honesty, and let the evidence of his usefulness speak for itself. In doing so, he embodied the larger transformation of West Germany from defeated adversary to trusted partner within the Western Alliance. There were moments when the weight of history pressed close. During a joint exercise involving multiple nations, Topp observed American and British submarines operating in coordinated patterns that would once have been directed against boats like the ones he had commanded. He felt no resentment, only a clear-eyed recognition of how thoroughly the strategic landscape had shifted. Later, in conversation with an American officer whose father had served in the Pacific, the talk turned to the shared experience of naval service across generations. The younger man spoke of lessons passed down from his own father about the cost of underestimating an opponent's resolve. Topp listened and offered his own perspective on the importance of adaptability. The exchange was brief, professional, and entirely without drama. Yet it represented the quiet work of bridge building that defined his posting more than any single dramatic moment. As the years in Washington accumulated, Topp's role expanded beyond tactical advice into broader contributions to alliance cohesion. He participated in discussions about how former adversaries could maintain credible deterrence while avoiding the cycles of suspicion that had once led to catastrophe. His voice carried weight precisely because he had lived through the alternative. When he spoke of the human cost of miscalculation at sea, officers from multiple nations listened with the attention reserved for someone who had earned his perspective the hard way. Topp never sought the spotlight. He simply continued to do the work with the same steady focus that had once guided a submarine through contested waters. The personal satisfaction he drew from this period came not from public recognition but from the accumulating evidence that his presence helped normalize cooperation that had once seemed impossible. The deeper stories of this era often remained hidden beneath the formal language of treaties and joint communiques. Behind the official integration of the Bundesmarine into NATO lay countless individual journeys of adaptation, reconciliation, and quiet contribution. Men like Topp carried the full weight of their past service while helping to construct a future in which that service could inform rather than undermine collective security. These personal layers of courage and growth deserve to be remembered alongside the larger strategic shifts they helped make possible. If the story of this former U-boat commander now serving at the heart of an alliance once arrayed against him has drawn you into the human heart of post-war reconciliation, then you will find even richer layers waiting in the hidden campaigns that ran parallel to the visible conflicts of the era. Signing up for our free email newsletter will bring you the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dive articles that uncover the hidden espionage, intelligence battles, and overlooked heroes that ran parallel to the U-boat campaigns Topp knew so well. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When Topp eventually returned to Germany after his Washington posting, he carried with him not only professional accomplishments but a deeper personal understanding of how former enemies could become partners in preserving peace. The bridge he had helped build was not constructed of treaties alone. It was built through countless small acts of professional respect, through honest exchanges about painful history, and through the daily demonstration that competence and integrity could transcend the divisions of war. The man who had once slipped beneath the Atlantic in pursuit of targets now helped shape a structure meant to ensure that no future generation would face the same desperate choices. The NATO bridge stood not as a monument to any single individual but as living proof that individuals could choose, even after the most bitter conflict, to contribute to something larger than vengeance or isolation. Topp's journey from Kriegsmarine ace to transatlantic ally had reached its most visible chapter, yet the quieter work of living that transformation would continue long after the uniform was finally set aside. The quiet of his study held the weight of every mile he had traveled beneath the sea, and when Erich Topp finally opened the notebook that had waited on his desk for months, the first words came slowly, as if the pen itself hesitated before committing memory to paper. He had carried the story inside him for decades, through the long years of rebuilding a civilian life, through the unexpected return to uniform in a Navy reborn under different principles, and through the quiet satisfaction of watching his sons grow into men who would never know the particular weight of command at sea during those desperate years. The decision to write had not arrived in a single dramatic moment. It had grown gradually, fed by conversations with younger officers who asked questions he could no longer answer with the simple clarity of orders given and followed. It had been strengthened by the knowledge that the men who had served beside him were disappearing one by one, taking their own versions of the truth with them. And it had been shaped by a private conviction that the story of those years deserved to be told by someone who had lived them, not as legend or accusation, but as the complicated human experience it had actually been. The early pages came hardest. He wrote of the boy who had once carved model ships from scraps of wood, of the pull of the horizon that had drawn him into the Navy, and of the first patrols in small coastal boats where the sea had taught its earliest and cruelest lessons. Each memory required him to pause, to sit with the faces of men who had not returned, and to find words that honored their courage without softening the reality of what they had been asked to do. There were nights when the writing stopped altogether, when the weight of a particular loss felt too sharp to set down. On those evenings he would rise from his desk and walk through the quiet house, pausing at the doorways of rooms where his sons had once slept, letting the ordinary sounds of a settled life steady him before he returned to the page. His wife understood these silences without needing explanation. She would sometimes bring him a cup of tea and sit nearby without speaking, offering the simple presence that had carried them both through so many difficult seasons. As the manuscript grew, Topp found himself returning again and again to the small human moments that had sustained the crews through the longest nights. He wrote of the young rating who had once divided a single piece of chocolate among his shipmates without being asked, of the quiet conversations that passed between men during the long submerged hours when every sound seemed to carry the thread of discovery. He described the way a single steady hand on a trembling shoulder could steady an entire compartment during a depth charge attack. These were not the stories of dramatic victories or narrow escapes that filled the popular accounts. There were the quieter threads of endurance and mutual care that had allowed ordinary men to keep functioning when everything around them pressed toward collapse. In setting them down, Topp felt he was preserving something more valuable than any tally of ships sunk or tonnage claimed. He was recording the human texture of a life lived under constant pressure, the small kindnesses that had made survival possible when survival itself had become the only victory still within reach. The invitation to serve as technical advisor on the film Sharks and Little Fish arrived while the memoir was still taking shape. The producers wanted authenticity in their portrayal of life aboard a U-boat during the later years of the war, and they had sought out the man whose own experiences most closely matched the story they hoped to tell. Topp approached the work with the same careful attention he had once brought to every patrol. He walked the sets that recreated the cramped interiors of the boats, adjusting details of equipment placement and crew movement until they felt true to the reality he had known. He spoke with the young actors who would portray the sailors, answering their questions about the constant tension of living in a steel tube beneath the surface, about the way fear and boredom could occupy the same moment, about the particular sound a hull made when depth charges exploded nearby. One afternoon he found himself standing beside a young man who was preparing for a scene in which his character would face a sudden emergency. The actor confessed quietly that he could not quite imagine the weight of responsibility that came with knowing every life in the compartment depended on split-second decisions. Topp did not offer dramatic advice. He simply described the way an experienced hand might reach over during chaos and steady a valve or a frightened shipmate, the small instinctive acts that kept fear from becoming panic. The actor listened, nodded, and later performed the scene with a quiet conviction that carried more truth than any shouted command could have conveyed. The conversations that grew from the film work extended beyond the set. Young people who had grown up hearing only the broadest outlines of the war approached Topp with questions that mixed curiosity and a genuine desire to understand. They asked how men could continue fighting when the larger cause had already revealed its moral bankruptcy. They asked what it felt like to return home to a defeated nation and begin again. They asked whether the skills of war could ever be fully separated from the purposes for which they had been used. Topp answered each question with the same measured honesty he had brought to the pages of his memoir. He spoke of the difference between professional duty and blind obedience, of the moments when individual conscience had to find its own narrow path through impossible circumstances. He did not offer easy absolution for himself or for the generation that had served. Instead, he spoke of the private reckonings that had come later, of the long work of building a different Germany alongside men who had once been enemies. These conversations left him both exhausted and strangely hopeful. The young people who asked the hardest questions were also the ones most determined to learn from the past rather than repeat it. In their faces he saw the possibility that the story he was trying to tell might find listeners who would carry its lessons forward. The publication of the memoir brought its own quiet challenges. Some readers approached the book expecting either heroic adventure or simple condemnation. Others found in its pages the more complicated truth Topp had worked to preserve, a portrait of men who had shown extraordinary courage and endurance while serving a cause that had led their nation into catastrophe. Letters arrived from former shipmates, from families of men who had not returned, from readers who had lived through the same years in different uniforms. Many expressed gratitude for an account that treated the human experience of submarine service with respect while refusing to romanticize the larger conflict. A few wrote with anger or disappointment, feeling that the book had not gone far enough in either celebration or apology. Topp read each letter carefully. He answered those that seemed to come from genuine engagement, offering clarification where it was needed and acknowledging the pain that still surrounded the war for so many. The process of responding became another form of the long work of confronting legacy. He was not seeking to shape how history would judge him. He was trying, in the time remaining to him, to leave an account honest enough that future generations might find in it some useful truth about the cost of war and the resilience of those who must fight it. The film and the memoir together created a different kind of bridge than the one he had helped build during his NATO years. Where the earlier work had connected former enemies in the practical business of collective defense, these later projects connected generations across the divide of lived experience. Young people who had never known the particular tension of a submarine running silent could now glimpse, through the pages of the book or the images on the screen, something of what that life had demanded. Veterans who had carried their own silences for decades found in Topp's willingness to speak a permission to examine their own memories more carefully. The process was never comfortable. There were moments when the act of remembering brought back the sharp edge of old losses, when the private fears he had learned to manage during the war years resurfaced in the quieter setting of a study or a film set. Yet Topp continued because he had come to believe that the only way to honor the men who had served beside him was to tell their story without myth or simplification. The courage they had shown had been real. The cause in whose name they had shown it had been tragically flawed. Both truths deserved to stand. In the final years, as his strength began to fade, Topp found himself returning most often to the small human moments that had defined the life he had lived at sea and the life he had built afterward. He thought of the young men who had trusted him with their survival, of the quiet conversations that had passed between them during the longest nights, of the letters written and received across oceans that had carried the ordinary hopes of families waiting for news. He thought of the years spent drawing blueprints for buildings that would house families who would never know the particular fear of waiting for a depth charge to find its mark. He thought of the conversations with young people who asked the hardest questions and listened to the answers with open minds. These threads, woven together, formed the legacy he hoped to leave. Not a legend of unbreakable aces or infallible commanders, but a record of ordinary men who had shown extraordinary endurance and who had, in the aftermath of defeat, found ways to contribute to something better than the world they had once been asked to defend. The courage shown by sailors on every side of that long conflict had always been the same raw human courage, the willingness to face the sea and the enemy with whatever strength and skill they possessed. Whether they served under one flag or another, whether they returned home in victory or in defeat. They had all known the same cold nights on the bridge, the same tension of waiting for the next attack, and the same quiet relief when another patrol ended without disaster. That shared experience of duty and endurance transcended the political arguments that had sent them to sea. It belonged to the men themselves and to the families who had waited for them. If the story of this aging warrior setting down his memories and advising on a film that tried to capture the human truth of submarine service has stayed with you, then you will find a powerful companion in another chapter of naval courage from a different theater of the same war. The acclaimed film Midway brings to life the extraordinary bravery of sailors and aviators who faced their own impossible trials in the Pacific, men who, like those who served in the Atlantic until the very end, answered the sea's demanding call when their nations needed them most. It is a stirring tribute that honors the shared legacy of duty and sacrifice across all who served on the oceans during those dark years. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the final pages of the memoir were written and the last consultations on the film had been completed, Erich Topp sat for a long time in the quiet of his study. The notebook that had once felt so heavy now lay closed on the desk, its pages filled with the story he had carried for so long. He felt neither triumph nor simple relief. What remained was the quieter satisfaction of a task completed as honestly as he knew how. The legacy he left behind was not a monument to any single achievement or a defense of any particular cause. It was the accumulated record of a life lived at the intersection of extraordinary events and ordinary human endurance, a life that had asked hard questions of its owner and had, in the end, received answers shaped by both courage and conscience. The sea that had once claimed so much from him had also given him the long perspective needed to see that story clearly. Now, in the quiet that remained, he could finally set it down and let it speak for itself. The gentle light of a December morning found Erich Topp sitting by the window of his quiet home, his eyes resting on the familiar line where earth met sky, and in that stillness he sensed that the long journey which had carried him from a boy's carved ships to the bridges of submarines and the conference rooms of NATO was finally drawing to its close. He had lived long enough to see the world change in ways that once would have seemed impossible. The Germany he had served as a young officer had been replaced by one that stood as a partner rather than an adversary among nations. The sea that had once been a battlefield now rolled under skies patrolled by forces committed to keeping the peace he had helped to build. In the years since he had set aside his uniform for the final time, Topp had moved through the ordinary rhythms of a life shaped by reflection rather than command. He rose early, as he always had, and spent quiet hours reading or walking the paths near his home. His wife remained the steady center of that life, her presence a quiet reminder of the family he had built after the war had taken so much from so many. Their sons, now grown men with lives of their own, visited when they could, bringing grandchildren who knew their grandfather as a gentle man who told stories of the sea without ever glorifying the violence it had contained. In these small, ordinary exchanges Topp found the deepest satisfaction of his later years. The weight of command had been replaced by the lighter but no less real responsibility of passing on what he had learned to those who would carry the future. Private reflections filled the hours that were no longer claimed by duty. He thought often of the men who had served beside him, of the young faces that had looked to him for steadiness when depth charges shook the hull and when the future itself had seemed uncertain. Some of those men had not lived to see the peace he now enjoyed. Others had returned to build lives as he had, carrying their own silences and their own reckonings. Topp kept in touch with a few who remained, exchanging letters that spoke of grandchildren and quiet retirements rather than the patrols that had once defined them. These correspondences were small acts of continuity, threads that connected the man he had become to the officer he had once been. In one such letter he wrote of the strange comfort found in knowing that the skills which had once been used for war could, in another life, help to prevent it. He did not dwell on regret. Instead, he focused on the quiet gratitude that he had been given time to contribute to something larger than the conflict that had shaped his youth. The physical limitations that come with great age arrived gradually and were met with the same steady acceptance that had carried him through every previous challenge. He moved more slowly, rested more often, and accepted help when it was offered without complaint. His wife noticed the small signs first, the way he paused longer at the top of the stairs, the way his gaze sometimes lingered on old photographs with a deeper stillness. They spoke of these changes without drama, treating them as another chapter in a life that had already asked so much of them both. Topp found that the private fears which had once centered on survival at sea had been replaced by a quieter concern for the legacy he would leave. He wanted his sons and grandchildren to understand that a man could serve his country with honor even when that service had taken place within a larger story of tragedy and moral failure. He wanted them to know that redemption was possible, not through denial of the past, but through the patient work of building something better in its aftermath. These conversations, often held in the evening when the house was quiet, became some of the most important of his later years. They allowed him to pass on not only stories but the deeper conviction that honesty about difficult history was itself a form of service. As the final December arrived, Topp moved through its early days with the same quiet rhythm that had marked his retirement. He read the news, took short walks when the weather allowed, and spent time with family when they could visit. The approach of the holidays brought a gentle anticipation rather than any sense of urgency. He had lived through enough winters to know that the season carried its own quiet gifts, the warmth of shared meals, the comfort of familiar voices, the simple presence of those who had walked the long road beside him. On the morning of the 26th he woke feeling the familiar weight of years but also a deeper sense of peace. He spoke with his wife about small household matters, about a book he was reading, about the grandchildren who would visit soon. There was no dramatic farewell, no sense that this day was different from any other. He simply moved through the hours with the same steady presence that had defined him for 9 decades. In the afternoon he rested, and when evening came he slipped away quietly, surrounded by the family he had built and the quiet harbor he had earned. The news of his passing spread through naval circles and beyond with the respect that had always accompanied his name. Former shipmates, colleagues from his NATO years, and historians who had studied the long arc of his life offered tributes that spoke of professional excellence and personal integrity. Some remembered the young commander who had painted a red devil on a submarine's tower and led his crew through some of the most dangerous waters of the war. Others spoke of the older officer who had helped integrate a defeated navy into an alliance of former enemies, bringing hard-won lessons to the service of peace. There were those who noted the controversies that had shadowed certain actions, particularly the close-range attacks that had left deep questions about the conduct of war at sea. Yet even those who scrutinized his record acknowledged the larger truth of a life that had moved from the depths of conflict to the work of reconciliation. The respect that surrounded his memory was not the product of myth or simplification. It grew from the recognition that he had carried both the achievements and the moral complexities of his service with honesty, and that he had spent the decades after the war contributing to a Germany and a Europe that would never again descend into the catastrophe he had once been asked to serve. For his family, the loss was quieter and more personal. His wife and sons gathered to remember a man who had been many things: commander, architect, husband, father, and quiet bridge between worlds that had once been locked in bitter opposition. They spoke of his steady presence during difficult years, of the way he had listened without judgment when they brought their own questions about the past, of the small kindnesses that had marked his daily life. There were no grand public ceremonies, only the simple gathering of those who had loved him and the quiet recognition that a long and complicated journey had reached its end. In the days that followed, letters arrived from people whose lives had been touched by his story in ways he could never have known. Some were from young naval officers who had read his memoir and found in it a model of honest reflection. Others came from families of men who had served on both sides of the Atlantic conflict and who saw in Topp's life a path toward understanding rather than continued division. These messages formed their own quiet tribute, evidence that the lessons he had worked to preserve had found listeners beyond the circle of those who had known him personally. The enduring questions that surround a life like Topp's are not easily answered by any single narrative. What does it mean to serve with honor in a cause that history has judged harshly? How does a man carry both professional pride and moral reckoning across the decades? What does it take for former enemies to stand together in defense of peace? His journey offers no simple formulas, only the lived example of someone who refused to let the past become either a prison or a legend. He had known the exhilaration of early success and the despair of watching comrades disappear. He had experienced the strange freedom of defeat and the patient work of rebuilding. He had returned to uniform not to relive old glories, but to help ensure that the skills once used for war could serve the cause of preventing it. In each of these chapters he had remained, at his core, a man who believed that duty required both competence and conscience, and that the sea which had tested him so severely had also taught him the value of measured judgment and quiet endurance. The harsh realities of the war at sea, the sudden violence, the constant fear, the narrow margins between survival and loss, lived on in the memories of those who had endured them and in the records they left behind. Those raw experiences, captured in photographs that were never meant for public display, and footage that showed the unfiltered cost of every decision, and in the unvarnished accounts of veterans who carried the truth long after the guns fell silent, form an essential archive for anyone who wishes to understand what that conflict actually demanded of ordinary men. An exclusive digital collection now available brings together rare, uncensored photographs, original wartime footage, and veteran accounts from the Battle of the Atlantic that were deemed too raw or restricted for public broadcast, offering a deeper, unfiltered window into the harsh realities faced by men like those aboard U-552. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the end, Erich Topp's life stands as a testament to the possibility of carrying a complicated past without being defined by it. He had been many things: a boy drawn to the sea, a young officer learning the cost of command, a submarine ace whose name became legend, a defeated veteran rebuilding from nothing, an architect shaping spaces for families to heal, a flag officer helping former enemies stand together, and finally a quiet elder who chose honesty over myth. The questions his journey leaves behind are the questions that every generation must ask anew: how to honor courage without excusing its uses, how to remember without repeating, how to build peace from the ruins of war. He did not answer these questions with speeches or monuments. He answered them with the patient, daily work of a life lived in service to something larger than any single conflict. The sea that had once been his battlefield became, in the end, the quiet harbor where he could finally rest. And in that rest, the story he had carried for so long found its own kind of peace, not the peace of forgetting, but the deeper peace that comes from having told the truth as fully and as honestly as one human life allows.